welcome. Wherever you are, whatever time it is, make yourself comfortable. This is your time to unwind. You can also let us know in the comments where in the world you currently are and what time it is for you. The medieval bedroom, a place where Hollywood would have us believe knights and ladies spent their nights in steamy embrace, surrounded by the glow of candlelight and the rustle of silk sheets. But the reality? Well, let's say it's more likely to have involved a drafty room, the scent of dung wafting from the streets below, and some decidedly unromantic body odours. Welcome to the real Middle Ages, where sex and hygiene were often at odds, and romance was less about passion and more about politics and economics. First things first, let's tackle the myth of medieval hygiene, or, more accurately, the lack thereof. People often assume that the medieval folks were downright filthy, and while it's true that they weren't scrubbing down with Irish Spring every morning, they weren't as neglectful as you might think. Bathing was a thing, albeit not as frequently as our modern sensibilities might demand. Public bathhouses were common in larger towns, and people often took a soak in wooden tubs at home. However, the idea of a daily shower was as foreign to them as binge-watching Netflix would have been. The water was cold, the soap basic, if they had any at all, and the whole affair was more about not smelling worse than your neighbour rather than achieving any level of sterility. Now, let's shift to courtship rituals, if you can call them that. Forget about moonlit serenades or charming winks across a crowded banquet hall. Medieval courtship was a strategic game, one that would make modern dating apps seem straightforward. Marriages were more business transactions than love stories, with families negotiating dowries and land deals to secure alliances. A good marriage could elevate a family's status, bring wealth, or even prevent a blood feud. So, while Hollywood loves a good tale of star-crossed lovers, most medieval unions were more calculated than Cupid-inspired. Consider the marriage age. For noble girls, the average betrothal often occurred in adolescence, sometimes as young as 12, though consummation might wait a few years. Boys, on the other hand, typically married in their late teens or early 20s. The church played matchmaker and enforcer, putting the holy stamp of approval on unions and ensuring they complied with canon law. And let's not forget, the church had a vested interest in these matters. It was a powerful institution with its own land and political ambitions. Speaking of the church, it was both a moral compass and a meddlesome aunt, full of advice on how and when sex should occur. Theoretically, sex was for procreation only, a directive often ignored, but nevertheless preached with fervour. The church's stance on sex outside of marriage was clear. It was a sin, one that could lead to all sorts of spiritual and sometimes physical penalties. But the reality? People were people, and they often found ways around ecclesiastical decrees, sneaking around more often than not, as humans are wont to do. In terms of economics, marriage was a transaction with serious stakes. For noble families, wedding plans were akin to business mergers, with dowries acting as the currency of choice. A noble daughter's dowry could include land, livestock, and cold hard cash. For the peasantry, marriage was less about strategic alliances and more about practical concerns, like having enough hands to work the fields and mouths to feed. The economic imperative was clear. Marriage was less about love and more about survival. So, what's left of the medieval romance once you peel back the layers of myth? The truth is, people did fall in love, sneak off for trysts, and pine for unattainable partners. Courtly love, a concept that flourished in the 12th century, celebrated the notion of noble, often unrequited love, usually between a knight and a lady. But even this was more about chivalric ideals than actual practice. It was a cultural phenomenon that influenced literature more than actual marriages. In a world where marriages were strategic and hygiene was optional, the medieval bedroom was less of a boudoir and more of a multi-purpose room. It was where families often slept together, with privacy being a luxury few could afford. The flickering candlelight and heavy drapes might have offered some semblance of intimacy, but let's be real, medieval architecture wasn't exactly soundproof, and the neighbours were probably just a thin wall away. To sum it all up, medieval sex was a far cry from Hollywood's glamorized versions. It was messy, strategic, and often dictated by forces beyond the couple themselves. The church's influence, economic necessity, and societal norms all played leading roles in the medieval love story, leaving little room for the kind of romantic escapades we might hope for. But amidst all the politics and practicality, there were still moments of genuine affection and human connection, proof that even in the grittiest of settings, love finds a way to sneak in, often through the back door. But let's not get too carried away with sentimentality. It's time to dive into the cold, hard cash side of medieval love. Picture this. A wedding back then wasn't just a celebration of two souls coming together. It was a full-on economic summit. Dowries were the medieval equivalent of a financial handshake, a way to sweeten the marriage deal or, in some cases, make it palatable at all. And boy, did they come with a price tag. We're talking real estate, livestock, and sometimes even a few serfs thrown in for good measure. The stakes were so high that when a noble daughter got engaged, it was less about picking out flowers and more about counting the coins. Take Eleanor of Aquitaine, for example, who brought not just a dowry but an entire duchy into her marriage with King Louis VII of France. Her dowry was the medieval version of landing a CEO with a hefty stock option package. And let's not forget the 1537 marriage of Jane Seymour to Henry VIII, where she came with a modest 1,000 dowry, a sum that might seem small compared to Eleanor's Grand Duchy, but was still a princely amount back in the day. To put it in context, that 1,000 would be equivalent to about 800,000 today. Not exactly pocket change. Marriage contracts turned this whole affair into a business meeting, complete with negotiations that would make modern prenuptials look like a casual chat over coffee. These contracts outlined not just the dowry, but detailed what each party brought to the table and what would happen if things went south. For nobles, it was an exercise in estate planning, ensuring that land and titles were passed on without a hitch. And if you were a commoner, well, you might not have had lands to barter, but marriages were still strategic alliances, often to secure more hands for the family farm or to pool resources to survive the harsh winter months. Speaking of pooling resources, let's talk about medieval weddings, events that could rival today's celebrity nuptials in terms of excess and spectacle. Forget about a quaint ceremony followed by a simple reception. Medieval weddings were grand affairs, with feasts that could last for days, complete with entertainers, musicians, and enough food to feed a small army. The cost was so exorbitant that it was often shared between families, essentially a joint venture in merrymaking. In some cases, the entire village would partake, because who doesn't love a good party when someone else is footing the bill? But why such extravagance? Well, weddings were a public declaration of status and wealth, a way to show off the family's prosperity and connections. The bigger the bash, the more impressive the family. It was medieval social media before hashtags and likes, a way to broadcast your standing to the world. And let's face it, nothing says we've made it quite like a 5-day feast with enough roast boar to clog every artery in the kingdom. Of course, not everyone could afford such lavish celebrations. For the peasants, weddings were more modest affairs, often held in a local church with whatever feast could be scraped together. The economic realities were stark, and so were the choices. But even in these humbler settings, the transaction was at the center of the ceremony. The dowry might be a cow or a couple of sheep, and the marriage contract might be a simple verbal agreement. But the economic imperative was the same. Survival and social mobility were on the line. And let's not forget the church's cut. The ecclesiastical powers that be had their fingers in many pies, and marriage was no exception. Fees were required for the banns to be read, for the ceremony itself, and sometimes even for the privilege of having the marriage blessed. It was a tidy little earner, and a reminder that while love might make the world go round, it was money that greased the wheels. So, we're left with a picture of medieval love that's less about romance and more about ROI. Return on investment. Marriage was a complex web of financial considerations, strategic alliances, and social climbing. It was a transaction that required careful planning, a bit of luck, and a healthy dose of pragmatism. But amidst all the negotiations and number crunching, there was still room for genuine connection. After all, even in a world where love was often a business deal, the heart had a funny way of finding its own path. And while medieval marriages may have started with a ledger and a contract, they often ended with companionship and, dare we say, a little bit of love. And just like that, we segue from the economics of medieval matrimony to the mythological realm of the chivalric lover, a notion that's about as realistic as a dragon-slaying knight with perfect hair. Ah, the troubadours. Those romantic poets of the 12th century who wandered court to court, spinning tales of noble love and gallant knights wooing unattainable ladies. They painted a picture of a world where love was pure, selfless, and utterly impractical. But let's be real, the average medieval marriage was less Shakespearean sonnet and more tax return. The concept of courtly love, or amour courtois, if you want to impress at your next dinner party, was essentially a literary construct. It was a set of ideals that suggested love should be ennobling, secretive, and often doomed. Think of it as the medieval version of a soap opera, with all the intrigue and none of the DVR. Knights would pledge their hearts to their liege lord's lady, vowing to serve her with all the fervour of a teenager who's just discovered their first crush. In theory, it was about aspiring to higher virtues through love. In practice, it was more about crafting a good story than crafting a life together. Take the famous tale of Lancelot and Guinevere, a classic case of courtly love that ends in disaster. Here was a knight who, despite his sterling reputation, found himself in a scandalous affair with King Arthur's queen. The affair ended in betrayal and, spoiler alert, a lot of dead bodies. But despite the carnage, the story lived on, inspiring countless ballads and medieval memes, also known as illuminated manuscripts. It served as a cautionary tale, a romantic tragedy, and also a medieval bestseller. The reality for most married women, however, was about as glamorous as a rusty suit of armour. Marriages, especially among the nobility, were strategic alliances where the bride often had as much say as a pawn in a chess game. The average medieval woman was more likely to be managing a household than swooning over a knight in shining armour. Her duties included everything from overseeing servants to handling the finances and ensuring the family estate didn't fall into disrepair while hubby was off jousting or crusading. Legally, women were often seen as extensions of their fathers or husbands. The laws of coverture meant that a woman's legal identity was subsumed under her husband's upon marriage. In other words, when she said "I do," she also said goodbye to her legal rights. Divorce? Unthinkable, unless you were ready to face the wrath of the church, which held the monopoly on marital status and wasn't exactly known for its progressive views on gender equality. But, and here's the kicker, literature had a funny way of influencing real life, even back then. The tales of courtly love, with all their idealized romance, seeped into the consciousness of the medieval elite. Young knights and ladies, raised on these tales, began to emulate them, at least in their secret hearts. It created a tension between what was expected in marriage, a social contract, and what was desired in love, a personal connection. Primary sources from the period reveal this tension. Take the Lays of Marie de France, a collection of narrative poems from the 12th century. Marie's stories feature strong-willed women and often rebellious love, a clear nod to the dissonance between societal expectations and personal desires. In Lanville, for example, the titular knight falls for a fairy queen, choosing love over duty, a fantasy that resonated with audiences who longed for something more than the everyday drudgery of medieval life. Feudal obligations also played a crucial role in shaping relationships. A knight owed his loyalty first to his liege lord, which sometimes made his marriage feel like a secondary concern. Duty to one's lord took precedence over personal happiness, and often these obligations meant long periods away from home. Imagine trying to foster a romantic relationship when your main job is defending the realm or participating in a crusade several hundred miles away. Absence might make the heart grow fonder, but it also makes communication tricky when your only options are messengers who take weeks to deliver a letter. And while we're on the topic of communication, let's talk about the medieval letter, a key tool for clandestine lovers. These missives were often the only way to maintain a romantic connection. But given the literacy rates of the time, writing a love letter required some skill. It wasn't uncommon for scribes to compose these letters, turning a simple "I miss you" into a flowery declaration worthy of a troubadour. After all, if you're going to risk your head for love, it might as well be for a well-crafted sonnet. In essence, the troubadours and their tales of courtly love offered an escape, a fantasy world where love could transcend duty and social constraints. But the stark reality was that for most medieval folks, love was a luxury, not a necessity. The economic and social imperatives of the time meant that marriage was a practical institution designed to secure alliances, propagate heirs, and ensure the continuity of family lines. So, as we peel back the layers of this myth, we're left with a medieval world that's far more complex than the one painted by the troubadours. Love was not absent, but it was often relegated to the margins of life, a whispered secret rather than a public declaration. The stories of knights and ladies, of forbidden love and chivalric devotion, were more than just entertainment. They were a reflection of the human desire to find meaning and connection in a world dominated by duty and obligation. And while the tales might have been exaggerated, the emotions they captured were as real then as they are today. But hold that thought. There's more to uncover about the medieval love saga, from the church's moral meddling to the everyday realities of peasant life. Onward, as we continue to explore the intricacies of love, medieval style. Now, let's dive headfirst into the medieval courtroom, where the drama isn't just about who stole whose pigs, but who's sleeping with whose spouse. Yes, welcome to the world of medieval legal and societal frameworks governing sexual conduct, where the church and state joined forces to play the ultimate game of morality police. Move over, Judge Judy, because these folks had some seriously draconian ideas about justice. First off, let's talk about the church's role as moral gatekeeper. If you thought the modern world has a monopoly on invasive moralizing, think again. The medieval church was the self-appointed arbiter of sexual propriety, and it had a lot to say. Premarital sex? That was a fast track to hell, my friend. Adultery? Even worse. The church's stance was clear. Sex was for procreation, preferably with your spouse, and anything else was a sin waiting to be confessed. And if you were caught in the act, well, you might find yourself doing some serious penance. In the 11th century, the penitential books, sort of like a medieval Spotify playlist of sins, laid it all out. Premarital sex could earn you a year of bread and water, while adultery might see you stuck with 7 years of fasting. That's right, 7 years. Suddenly, your New Year's resolution to lose a few pounds doesn't seem so daunting. But it wasn't just about spiritual punishment. Secular laws also had a say in what you did in the privacy of your own bedchamber, or the hayloft as it were. Take the case of the 13th century English laws under King Henry III. Adultery could be punished by public shaming, flogging, or even fines. It was less about moral outrage and more about maintaining social order. After all, nothing says, "Don't mess with marital stability," like dragging someone through the streets with their tunic covered in tar and feathers. Now, if you think these punishments sound severe, you'd be right. But in a society where lineage and inheritance were everything, ensuring paternity was a serious business. Inheritance disputes could get uglier than a medieval dental procedure, and no one wanted to question the legitimacy of their heirs. So, the laws were as much about protecting property rights as they were about moral purity. One infamous example of medieval legal overreach is the case of Marjorie Kempe, an English Christian mystic who lived in the 14th and 15th centuries. After experiencing a spiritual conversion, she vowed to remain celibate, despite being married. Her husband, John, wasn't entirely thrilled about this arrangement, and the local authorities weren't keen on her newfound independence either. Marjorie was often accused of heresy, a charge that could lead to execution. While she managed to avoid the stake, her life was a constant battle against the social and legal expectations of married women. But wait, there's more! Let's not forget about the medieval concept of fornication. The term itself is delightfully archaic, but it had some very real consequences. Fornication was any sexual activity outside of marriage, and it was a big no-no. In some places, like 14th century Venice, those caught could face hefty fines, imprisonment, or public humiliation. The motto seemed to be, shame now, pay later. And while the church and state were busy policing the populace, the people themselves found ingenious ways to circumvent the rules. Love letters, clandestine meetings, and even bribing officials were all part of the game. It turns out, where there's a will, there's a way, or at least a secret rendezvous spot. The sheer volume of court cases involving sexual misconduct hints at a society constantly grappling with the tension between desire and doctrine. Speaking of court cases, let's highlight another juicy example. The scandalous affair of King Edward II of England and Piers Gaveston in the early 14th century. Edward's close relationship with Gaveston, often described as overly intimate, ruffled more than a few feathers. The nobility, concerned about Gaveston's influence, forced Edward to exile his favourite not once but several times. Eventually, things took a grim turn when Gaveston was captured and executed in 1312, a brutal reminder of how personal relationships could have political repercussions. But why all this fuss over who was doing what with whom? Well, it wasn't just about moral policing for its own sake. At its core, these laws and teachings were about control. The church wielded spiritual authority while the state enforced social order. Together, they maintained a framework that supported the status quo, ensuring that social hierarchies remained unchallenged. It was a system that left little room for personal freedom, but plenty of space for hypocrisy. And yet, despite the strictures and statutes, love found a way. People continued to fall in love, to dream of a life beyond what was dictated by the clergy and the crown. The laws might have been written in stone, or rather, on parchment. But human desire was as fluid as ever. It's a testament to the resilience of the human spirit that even in a world bound by rules, the heart could still wander where it pleased. As we dig deeper into the medieval legal landscape, remember that while the church and state were busy crafting laws, the people were equally busy finding loopholes. It was a cat-and-mouse game that played out over centuries, a dance between duty and desire that kept the courts busy and the confessionals full. And so, with legal tomes and love letters in hand, we march onward through the annals of medieval history, because where there's law, there's bound to be a loophole and a story worth telling. Stay tuned for more revelations from the world of medieval love, where the stakes were high and the consequences often dire. As we dig deeper into the medieval legal landscape, remember that while the church and state were busy crafting laws, the people were equally busy finding loopholes. It was a cat-and-mouse game that played out over centuries, a dance between duty and desire that kept the courts busy and the confessionals full. Now, let's take a step back and look at the broader implications of these medieval norms. It's easy to dismiss them as relics of a bygone era, but their echoes still resound in today's world, influencing how we perceive romance and marriage. The medieval era wasn't just about forbidding love and enforcing celibacy. It was about laying the groundwork for the complex web of expectations we navigate today. Consider the concept of courtly love, that medieval soap opera of knights and their unattainable muses. It might seem as outdated as a VHS collection, but its influence on modern romantic ideals is undeniable. We see it in the way Hollywood churns out tales of impossible love stories, where passion must overcome insurmountable odds. The idea that true love should be challenging, even painful, has roots in these medieval tales. It's the same narrative that drives countless rom-coms and keeps Valentine's Day card companies in business. But here's the kicker. While the medieval tales of romance were all about unattainable ideals, the marriages of the time were starkly pragmatic. Today, we still juggle these dual narratives. On one hand, we crave the fairy tale. On the other, we acknowledge that relationships require work and, yes, a bit of financial acumen. The notion that love is an investment, both emotional and economic, dates back to when dowries were as crucial as love letters. So, if you've ever felt like your relationship is more spreadsheet than sonnet, thank the medieval matchmakers for that. The Church's moral policing also left a legacy that's hard to shake. While ecclesiastical courts no longer dictate our bedroom activities, the notion that certain types of love are right or wrong lingers. Modern debates over marriage equality and reproductive rights echo these ancient discussions. The Church's insistence on procreation as the sole purpose of sex has rippled through the ages, influencing everything from birth control debates to societal expectations about family life. But let's not forget the economic angle. Medieval marriages were heavily influenced by wealth and status, a trend that remains stubbornly persistent today. The concept of marrying up or securing a financially advantageous match is not a new phenomenon. It's as old as the hills, or at least as old as the feudal system. While we might not barter brides for cattle anymore, the idea that love and money are intertwined persists. Think of modern prenups and celebrity marriages. They're not so different from those medieval contracts that outlined every detail of a marital union. Yet, amidst all this pragmatism, there's a more hopeful legacy, the perseverance of love itself. Even in a world bound by duty, people found ways to connect. The clandestine meetings, love letters, and whispered promises of the medieval period remind us that love is resilient. It finds a way even when the odds are stacked as high as a medieval castle wall. And speaking of resilience, let's talk about the women of the Middle Ages. Often seen as pawns in the game of marriage, they were far from passive. Women like Eleanor of Aquitaine wielded power in ways that defied expectations, using marriage as a tool for political strategy. they navigated their world with a shrewdness that would make any modern CEO proud. The medieval woman might not have had the legal rights we take for granted, but she knew how to work within and around the system. So, as we wrap up our journey through the medieval love landscape, let's debunk one final myth, that this era was a simple, monolithic time of oppression and ignorance. It was anything but. It was a period of contradictions, where love was both a powerful force and a transactional commodity. It was a time when the heart and the ledger clashed and colluded, creating a complex tapestry of human desires and societal demands. In the end, the Middle Ages remind us that love has always been a multifaceted creature. It's not just about grand gestures and whispered sweet nothings. It's about navigating the practical realities of life. The medieval world was a place where love and duty, romance and responsibility were forever entwined. And while we might have swapped castles for condos and troubadours for tinder, the fundamental questions about love, marriage and human connection remain remarkably unchanged. So, the next time you find yourself caught between a romantic ideal and reality's demands, think back to the medieval lovers who walked a similar tightrope. Their world was different, no doubt about that, but their struggles and triumphs offer timeless insights into the human condition. Because at the end of the day, whether you're a knight, a peasant, or just someone trying to make it work in the 21st century, love is a journey, not a destination. And sometimes, just sometimes, it really does find a way to conquer all. In the bustling streets of late 18th century London, a city that smelled as much of ambition as it did of horse manure, a boy named John Keats was coming of age. Born on October 31st, 1795, Keats was destined not for the opulent halls of nobility, but for a life shaped by both the poetry of the human spirit and the harsh realities of mortality. His father, Thomas Keats, was a livery stable keeper, a job that, despite its lack of glamour, provided a decent living. In today's terms, think of him as the Uber driver of horses, galloping through historical Uber Eats deliveries. Now, Keats's early life wasn't exactly a Dickensian tale of woe, but it wasn't a Victorian tea party either. His father's business at the Swan and Hoop Inn on Moorgate was solid enough to keep the family afloat, but the era wasn't exactly forgiving. London was a place where the air was thick with industry, and the streets were lined with a mix of beggars and businessmen. Despite the family's modest success, the shadow of tragedy loomed large and frequent. When John was just 8 years old, his father tragically died after falling from a horse, a freak accident that left young John with a profound awareness of life's fragility. If you're keeping track of emotional life lessons, that's lesson 1. Life's short, and gravity doesn't care about your plans. Following this, his mother, Frances, remarried a man named William Rawlings, an event that turned out to be as ill-fated as it sounds. 2 years later, Frances left Rawlings, taking her children with her, only to succumb to tuberculosis when John was 14. This was a blow that would echo throughout his poetry as he grappled with themes of loss and mortality. It's a stark reminder that for Keats, personal tragedy wasn't just a poetic muse, it was a lived experience. After his mother's death, Keats and his siblings were taken under the guardianship of Richard Abbey, a tea merchant who, in today's world, might be better suited to running a cutthroat hedge fund than nurturing the budding creativity in young wards. Abbey, ever the pragmatist, steered Keats toward a career in medicine. A stable choice back then, given that a surgeon apothecary could earn a respectable income, equivalent to around 30 a year, roughly 3,000 in today's money. It was a path that promised financial security, but little in the way of poetic inspiration. Living in this period of history, where the social ladder was more like a greasy pole, Keats was keenly aware of the economic pressures. Society was a rigid hierarchy, and moving beyond one's social class was about as easy as getting a horse to fly. The Regency era was a time when the cost of living was no joke. Bread, a staple for the masses, could take up a significant chunk of a household's budget. Picture this. A loaf of bread in the 1790s might cost 1 penny, with the average annual income for a labourer hovering around 20. Now, that's a lot of dough, literally and figuratively. By 1810, Keats was apprenticed to Thomas Hammond, a surgeon in Edmonton. He was supposed to learn the delicate art of cutting people open and sewing them back together, a skill set that might come in handy in a metaphorical sense for a poet. But it was during this time that Keats began to nurture his passion for literature. He devoured the works of Spenser, Shakespeare, and Milton with the enthusiasm of a modern-day teenager binge watching the latest Netflix series. In 1815, Keats enrolled at Guy's Hospital in London, where he would spend the next year training as a medical student. It was a demanding life, involving long hours and a curriculum that was as grueling as it was gory. His studies included anatomy dissections, where the only thing sharper than the scalpel was the stench. Despite his aptitude, his examiners noted his promise. Keats found himself increasingly drawn to the world of letters. Imagine the inner turmoil, a steady career as a doctor with a somewhat decent paycheck, or the uncertain path of poetry, where the only certainty was critical derision. And here comes the pivotal moment, the kind that memoirs are made of. In 1816, Keats made the bold decision to abandon medicine and pursue poetry full-time. A riskier career switch has rarely been made, akin to ditching a law degree to become a street performer today. But Keats wasn't just any young man with a quill. He had a way with words that could make the heart race and the mind wander. His first poem, O Solitude, was published in the Examiner, a liberal paper that didn't mind ruffling a few aristocratic feathers. The publication marked the beginning of his poetic journey, one that would be both dazzling and heartbreakingly short. Despite the romanticized image of the starving artist, Keats's decision was less about rebellion against societal norms and more about a compulsion, a calling that he couldn't ignore. He was living in a world where literature was as much a battleground of ideas as it was an art form. This was a time when the Romantic movement was challenging the rationalism of the Enlightenment, and poets were the rock stars of their day, albeit underpaid ones. Keats, with his keen sensitivity to beauty and emotion, fit right into this cultural upheaval. So, while the legend of Keats often paints him as a destitute dreamer, the reality is more nuanced. Yes, he faced financial struggles, exacerbated by his guardian Abby's tight-fisted approach to the family trust fund. But his choice to embrace poetry wasn't just about poverty, it was about purpose. Keats was driven by an inner necessity to explore the depths of human experience, to capture the fleeting beauty of the world with a precision that even the sharpest scalpel couldn't achieve. As we leave young John Keats at the cusp of his poetic career, remember this: his life, much like his poetry, is an intricate tapestry of beauty and tragedy, woven together by the hands of fate and his own indomitable spirit. The next chapters of his story would unfold with all the intensity of a Shakespearean drama, but for now we leave him poised at the edge of greatness, quill in hand, ready to write his way into the annals of literary history. Keats now stood at the dawn of his poetic journey, quill in hand, ready to dive headfirst into the tumultuous waters of the early 19th century literary scene, a world as cutthroat as it was culturally rich. London was the pulse of this vibrant beat, where the Romantic movement was challenging the old Enlightenment ideals with the fervour of a rock concert mosh pit. Yet not everyone was clapping along to the rhythm. Enter the Cockney school of poetry, a term coined by critics with all the subtlety of a sledgehammer, aimed squarely at a group of poets from London's lower social strata who had the audacity to write verse. Keats found himself rubbing shoulders with these literary rebels, including the likes of Leigh Hunt, who not only edited the Examiner, but also served as a sort of literary godfather to Keats. Hunt was a man who combined radical politics with a penchant for poetry, his pen as sharp as his wit. He was the kind of guy who'd throw a party where you'd find revolutionaries and romantics sharing a bottle of sherry. For Keats, it was an intoxicating mix, offering him a platform and a sense of belonging in a city that could be as isolating as it was inspiring. But let's talk about the critics, those delightful humans who've never met a budding talent they couldn't attempt to squash. The term Cockney School was coined by Blackwood's Edinburgh magazine, a publication that made its money by tearing apart young poets with the glee of a shark in a swimming pool. Keats, despite his genuine talent, was roasted for his humble origins and association with Hunt. The critics were less concerned with the quality of his verse and more with the fact that he hadn't been born with a silver spoon or quill in his mouth. And so, one of the biggest myths about Keats is that he was instantly recognized as a literary genius. In reality, his early reception was more akin to a modern-day internet pylon, complete with personal jabs and unrelenting scrutiny. Now, let's set the scene with some economic context, because the harsh realities of publishing were as unkind as the critics. In 1818, the cost of producing a poetry book was significant. Printing a small edition of 500 copies could run up to 100, a sum that would make any struggling writer's wallet weep. For perspective, that's around 8,000 today, or the price of a used car. If you could find one that doesn't look like it's done a lap of the moon. Add to that the fact that poetry wasn't exactly flying off the shelves like the latest mystery thriller, and you've got a recipe for financial disaster. Despite these odds, Keats pushed forward, driven by the kind of artistic fervour that makes you question your life choices at 3 a.m. His first volume, Poems Poetic, published in 1817, didn't exactly set the world on fire. It was met with a polite acknowledgement from the literary establishment, which is a genteel way of saying it was largely ignored. But Keats wasn't deterred. He returned to the poetic forge, hammering out verses with the determination of a man who knew he was born to write, even if the world hadn't caught on yet. Keats's work was deeply personal, reflecting his struggles and the beauty he saw in a world that often seemed indifferent to both. He drew inspiration from the world around him, crafting odes that would eventually become benchmarks of romantic poetry. His Ode to a Nightingale and Ode on a Grecian Urn were not just expressions of beauty, but also explorations of the ephemeral nature of existence, a theme that resonated with a young man who had become all too familiar with loss. As Keats's reputation slowly began to grow, he became acutely aware of the cost of literary fame. His association with the Cockney school left him vulnerable to attack, and the harsh words of critics like John Wilson Croker in the Quarterly Review could sting harder than any financial hardship. Croker famously dismissed Keats's Endymion with the kind of disdain usually reserved for a cold cup of tea, declaring that it is a better and a wiser thing to be a starved apothecary than a starved poet. Ouch. Still, Keats wasn't just a victim of his critics. He was also a shrewd observer of his own craft. He understood the transient nature of fame and the fickle tastes of the public. In a letter to his brother George, Keats wrote, "I think I shall be among the English poets after my death." It's a line that reflects both his ambition and his acceptance of the fact that true recognition might only come posthumously. Talk about playing the long game. In navigating the literary scene of his time, Keats was not only fighting for his place in the annals of poetry, but also grappling with the economic realities that dictated how art was consumed. The Regency era wasn't kind to those without means, and Keats, who had abandoned a potentially lucrative medical career, was acutely aware of the precariousness of his situation. But it was this very tension between the harsh realities of life and the sublime beauty of art that fueled his greatest work. By the time Keats published his third and final volume, Lamia, Isabella, The Eve of Sinsane, Agnes, and other poems, in 1820, his health was in decline, but his poetic prowess was reaching its peak. The collection was a critical success, finally earning him the recognition he deserved, though his financial struggles remained. It was a bittersweet victory, akin to finding an umbrella just as the storm starts to clear. Keats's journey through the literary landscape of early 19th century London offers a glimpse into a world where the cost of reputation was steep and the rewards often delayed. Yet, despite the obstacles, Keats's commitment to his craft and his belief in the power of poetry never wavered. He was a man who understood that the true currency of art is not immediate fame or fortune, but the ability to touch the human soul, a legacy that endures long after the critics have fallen silent. As we leave Keats at this juncture, poised on the precipice of both acclaim and personal tragedy, remember that his story is far from over. The next chapter will delve deeper into the personal trials that shaped his final years, offering a poignant reminder of the delicate balance between life and art. Stay tuned, because the tale of John Keats, much like his poetry, is an exploration of the human spirit that continues to resonate through the ages. With Keats poised on the precipice of acclaim and personal tragedy, let's dive into the maelstrom of his creative mind and the world that shaped his penmanship. Now, if there's a literary work that truly encapsulates the dichotomy between Keats the dreamer and Keats the realist, it's his epic poem, Endymion. Written in 1818, Endymion was Keats's bold foray into the epic tradition, a genre that required the sort of stamina usually reserved for marathon runners or relentless optimists. Endymion begins with the iconic line, "A thing of beauty is a joy forever." And while beauty may be timeless, it didn't exactly pay the rent. Keats's ambition was as grand as the poem itself, stretching over 4,000 lines. He took the Greek myth of Endymion, the mortal beloved by the moon goddess Selene, and transformed it into a sprawling meditation on the nature of beauty and love. But let's be honest, for the average Regency reader, slogging through that many lines of verse was more daunting than a modern-day tax return. Here's where the myth of Keats the beloved poet starts to unravel. While we might imagine Endymion being met with thunderous applause, the reality was more akin to a group of critics doing their best impression of a Greek chorus of disdain. The reviews were brutal. Blackwood's Edinburgh magazine, which had already made a hobby out of skewering Keats, described it as drivelling idiocy. Ouch. Remind you of internet trolls? They were the Regency equivalent, armed with quills instead of keyboards. But why the harsh reception? Part of it was undoubtedly snobbery. Keats, the young upstart from the so-called Cockney school, had dared to step into a realm traditionally dominated by the well-heeled elite. His lack of formal education and humble origins was seen as insurmountable barriers to true literary success. Critics were less impressed by his imaginative flights than they were appalled by his audacity. It was as if he'd walked into a fancy gala wearing a pair of muddy boots. Beyond the personal biases, the political climate also played a role. The early 19th century was a period of political upheaval and economic uncertainty. The Napoleonic Wars had ended, but the aftershocks were still rippling through society. Britain was a nation grappling with its identity, torn between the old order and the new. Romantic poets like Keats were seen as part of this cultural shift, their works challenging the status quo with their emphasis on emotion and individualism. For the conservative critics, Keats wasn't just writing poetry, he was writing revolution. Despite the critical mauling, Keats remained undeterred. He famously said, "I would sooner fail than not be among the greatest." This wasn't arrogance, it was an understanding that true art often requires sacrifice, and sometimes that sacrifice is a bruised ego. He was learning, growing, evolving. Keats saw Endymion, not as a failure, but as a necessary step in his artistic journey, a journey that was as much about the process as the product. Financially, however, the situation was less philosophical. Keats was still reliant on the goodwill of friends and the occasional windfall from his brother George, who had emigrated to America. The economics of poetry were as unforgiving as the critics. In the Regency era, the average poet could expect to sell only a few hundred copies, and the profit margins were thinner than the pages they were printed on. Keats wasn't writing for wealth, he was writing for legacy. As Keats's style evolved, so too did his understanding of poetry's purpose. He began to move away from the ornate language of Endymion, embracing a more restrained and mature voice. This shift is evident in his odes, which are considered some of the pinnacles of romantic poetry. Take Ode to a Nightingale, for instance, where Keats meditates on the tension between the eternal and the ephemeral, a theme that echoes his own life's precarious balance between artistic ambition and material reality. In Ode on a Grecian Urn, Keats explores the idea of art as a timeless observer of human experience, capturing moments of beauty and truth that outlast the transient nature of life. The famous closing lines, "Beauty is truth, truth beauty, that is all ye know on earth, and all ye need to know," encapsulate this philosophy with the kind of poetic finesse that makes you want to frame it on your wall. But here's the kicker. Keats's work, while celebrated today, wasn't universally adored in his lifetime. He was a poet ahead of his time, writing in a style that wouldn't be fully appreciated until decades later. The recognition he craved would largely elude him while he was alive, a bitter pill for any artist to swallow. Despite this, Keats never lost sight of his purpose. He wrote with an urgency and a passion that belied his age, producing a body of work in just a few short years that would influence generations to come. His poetry was an exploration of the human condition, a quest for meaning in a world that could be both breathtakingly beautiful and heartbreakingly cruel. As we leave Keats here, in the midst of his creative zenith, we do so with the understanding that his story is far from over. The final chapters of his life will see him confront personal trials that will test his resilience and deepen his understanding of the fragile nature of existence. Stay with us, because the journey of John Keats is one that continues to unfold with each line of verse, offering insights into the eternal dance between art and life. As we continue our journey with John Keats, we find him standing at a crossroads where artistic brilliance collides headlong with personal calamity. Enter stage left Fanny Brawne, the woman who would ignite a fire in Keats that not only fueled his poetry but also, in some ways, consumed him. If you think their romance was as straightforward as a Jane Austen plot, think again. In reality, it was more of a roller coaster ride, with emotional highs that soared like the larks in his verses and lows that scraped the depths of his increasingly fragile health. Keats met Fanny in 1808, and she quickly became the muse for some of his most passionate work. But let's set the record straight. Their relationship was far from the Victorian ideal of chaste courtship. It was intense, complicated, and as full of longing as a Taylor Swift ballad. Keats, deeply infatuated, found in Fanny both inspiration and torment, writing to her with an urgency that seemed to defy the very ticking of the clocks. "I have been astonished that men could die martyrs for religion," he wrote. "I have shuddered at it. I shudder no more. I could be martyred for my religion. Love is my religion. I could die for that. I could die for you." Yet, this wasn't just a tale of star-crossed lovers. Fanny was not the delicately passive figure some portray her to be. She was vivacious, fashionable, and not afraid to speak her mind. Their relationship was a partnership of equals, at least in terms of emotional intensity, but it was also fraught with misunderstandings and societal pressures. Keats's financial instability and declining health only added to the strain. At the time, being a poet didn't exactly come with a lucrative benefits package, more like the world's worst health insurance plan. Now, let's talk tuberculosis, that 19th century scourge that seemed to have a personal vendetta against the Romantic poets. Known as consumption back then, it was the disease that had already claimed Keats's mother and brother. In an era when medical knowledge was more art than science, the average doctor's toolkit was about as effective as a modern-day WebMD search for cough. Treatments ranged from the mildly ineffective, like bloodletting, to the downright absurd, think inhaling the smoke of burning herbs or drinking copious amounts of milk. And yet, despite its prevalence, tuberculosis was a death sentence for many, with little understanding of its causes or transmission. Keats himself had been showing symptoms since 1809, but it was in early 1820 when the full brunt of his illness hit. Imagine the horror of coughing up blood, an unmistakable sign of advanced tuberculosis, knowing full well what it meant. Keats, with the foresight of one who had watched his loved one succumb, identified his own fate with chilling clarity. "That drop of blood is my death warrant," he reportedly said. For a man so attuned to the beauty and brevity of life, this was not just a physical blow, but an existential one. The economics of healthcare at the time were as dire as the treatments themselves. Without the NHS or any form of social safety net, medical care was a luxury that could bankrupt families. Keats, with his meagre earnings and no family fortune to fall back on, relied heavily on the generosity of friends. His close circle, including fellow poet Charles Brown, stepped in to provide both financial and emotional support. But even with their help, the cost of treatment, doctor visits, medicines, and a supportive diet were a constant worry. The idea of health insurance was as foreign as a smartphone to a Regency gentleman. Despite these challenges, Keats continued to write, his work imbued with a poignant awareness of his mortality. The poems from this period, including the famous Ode to a Nightingale, reflect a man grappling with the impermanence of life and the search for transcendence through art. His writing was both a refuge and a form of rebellion against the creeping shadow of death. And what of the myth of Keats as the quintessential romantic hero, dying young and beautiful for his art? It's a narrative that appeals to the part of us that loves a tragic story, but it also glosses over the very real struggles he faced. Keats wasn't just a victim of fate. He was a man fighting tooth and nail against the confines of his circumstances, determined to leave behind a legacy that would outlive his brief years on earth. As his health deteriorated, the decision was made for Keats to convalesce in Italy, where the warmer climate was thought to be beneficial for those suffering from tuberculosis. Supported by his friends and the poet Shelley, who had offered his villa in Pisa, Keats set out in September 1820. The journey was both physically and emotionally taxing, an odyssey of hope and resignation. Fanny, left behind in England, was devastated, and their separation was a source of profound sorrow for both. In Rome, Keats's health continued to decline, and despite the care of his devoted friend Joseph Seven, who accompanied him, the end was inevitable. The economic burden of his illness weighed heavily, with Seven himself struggling to cover the costs of Keats's care. It was a grim reminder of the harsh realities faced by those who dared to pursue art over commerce. Keats died on February 23, 1821, at the tender age of 25. His final resting place in the Protestant cemetery in Rome bears the epitaph he famously chose himself: "Here lies one whose name was writ in water." It's a line that speaks to his awareness of the transience of life and the ephemeral nature of fame. Yet, in a twist of fate worthy of a Greek tragedy, it is precisely this impermanence that has cemented his place in literary history. The myth of Keats, the doomed poet, persists because it taps into our age-old fascination with the tragic genius. But behind the legend lies a man of extraordinary resilience and talent, whose work continues to resonate with its profound exploration of human emotion and experience. As we prepare to delve into the final chapter of Keats's life, we do so with an appreciation for the complexity of his story, a narrative that, like his poetry, is an intricate tapestry of beauty and struggle, woven with the threads of both myth and reality. In the final act of John Keats's life, we find him ensconced in Rome, a city that promised warmth and healing, but delivered the cold embrace of inevitability. With a climate supposedly kinder to his beleaguered lungs, Keats arrived in November 1820, accompanied by Joseph Seven, his loyal friend and fellow artist. Rome, with its ancient ruins and bustling piazzas, was a world away from the drizzly gloom of England, a stark contrast that must have felt both tantalizing and cruel to a poet rapidly running out of time. Keats's living situation in Rome was humble, to say the least. He stayed in a modest apartment on the Spanish Steps, a location more famous today for Instagram selfies than for its tragic historical poignancy. The room was sparsely furnished, with little more than a bed, a table, and a fireplace struggling to fend off the chill of winter evenings. Here, Keats spent his final months, confined to his bed as his health deteriorated. Despite his physical decline, Keats's mind remained a whirlwind of thoughts and emotions. He was acutely aware of his dwindling prospects, both in terms of health and finances. The economic burden was shared by Seven, who, despite his own limited means, provided care with a devotion that went beyond friendship. For a man who had once been part of London's vibrant literary circles, reliant on the kindness of a friend in a foreign land was a harsh reminder of his precarious existence. Keats himself acknowledged this dire financial situation, writing to friends with an openness about his monetary struggles that would make even the most hardened penny-pincher wince. He was painfully aware that his poetic endeavours had yet to yield the kind of financial stability that might have eased his final days. In a letter to his publisher, Keats lamented, "I am in that state of mind where I shall never be able to write again." It was a poignant admission from a man whose words had once flowed with the effortless grace of a nightingale's song. The economic realities of life as a poet in the early 19th century were brutally unforgiving. The cost of living in Rome, while somewhat cheaper than London, was still a challenge for someone with no steady income. Keats's reliance on his friends' generosity was a testament to the bonds he had forged, yet it underscored the lack of a safety net for artists of his time. There were no government grants, no artist residencies, just the stark reality of making ends meet through wit and good fortune. As Keats's health continued to decline, his thoughts turned increasingly to his own legacy. The myth of the doomed poets is an alluring one, painting a picture of a man whose life was tragically cut short, leaving behind a body of work destined to be discovered and lauded by future generations. But the reality was far more complex. Keats's awareness of his impending death was not romantic. It was a stark confrontation with his own mortality, a theme that ran through his poetry with the urgency of a ticking clock. Even in Rome, Keats's thoughts returned to England, to Fanny Brawne, and to the future he would never have. His letters from this time are filled with a haunting mixture of longing and resignation, a testament to the depth of his love and the cruel hand of fate. In one letter he wrote, "I can scarcely bid you good-bye even in a letter. I always made an awkward bow." It's a farewell that echoes with the pain of unfulfilled dreams and the acceptance of an unwelcome fate. Keats's death on February 23, 1821, at the age of 25, was a quiet affair, marked by the simplicity that had characterized much of his life. The legacy he left behind, however, was anything but. His burial in the Protestant cemetery in Rome with its now famous epitaph, "Here lies one whose name was writ in water," speaks to both his self-doubt and his understanding of the transient nature of life and fame. Yet, ironically, it is this very ephemerality that has immortalized him in the annals of literary history. In the years following his death, Keats's work gradually began to receive the recognition it deserved. The 19th century was a period of great change, with the Industrial Revolution reshaping society and the arts reflecting this transformation. As the Romantic movement gained traction, Keats's poetry found a new audience, one that resonated with his exploration of beauty, love, and mortality. His work was championed by literary giants such as Lord Byron and Percy Bysshe Shelley, who recognized in Keats a kindred spirit, a poet whose verses captured the essence of human experience with unmatched elegance. The myth-making around Keats's life began in earnest during the Victorian era, a time when the notion of the tortured artist held particular appeal. His early death, combined with his profound poetic output, created a narrative that was ripe for romanticization. Yet, as is often the case with myths, the truth is more intricate. Keats was not just a tragic figure, he was a man of immense talent and resilience, whose work continues to inspire and challenge readers to this day. The economic realities of Keats's life, the struggles he faced as an artist in a world that often undervalued creativity, add layers to his story that are as compelling as his poetry. His financial challenges were not merely a backdrop to his art, but an integral part of the narrative, shaping his choices and influencing his work. The reality of his situation serves as a reminder of the precarious nature of artistic careers, both then and now. In examining Keats's legacy, we are confronted with the duality of myth and reality. A young poet whose life was as fleeting as a summer's day, yet whose words have endured the test of time. His story is a testament to the power of art to transcend the confines of existence, to capture the fleeting moments of beauty and truth that define the human experience. Keats's life, much like his poetry, is a reminder that while our time on this earth may be brief, the impact of our words can be eternal. As we conclude our exploration of John Keats, we do so with a renewed appreciation for the complexity of his journey. His legacy is not just that of the doomed poet, but of a man who, despite the odds, left an indelible mark on the world of literature. In his own words, "A thing of beauty is a joy forever," and in Keats's case, the beauty he created continues to resonate with each new generation, a testament to the enduring power of the human spirit. Long before earbuds were tangling in pockets and Spotify curated our every vibe, the ancient Indians were already tuning into a different kind of playlist, one that was as much about appeasing celestial beings as it was about hitting the right note. Welcome to the Vedic Age, a time when music was less about bopping to the beat and more about cosmic harmony. We're diving into a world where the Samaveda, one of the 4 sacred texts, wasn't just reading material, but the ultimate jam session for chanting rituals. Back then, music had a job description: please the gods, maintain the cosmic order, and occasionally make your neighbor question if their eardrums were under siege. The Samaveda stands out in this ancient Spotify lineup as a collection of hymns specifically meant for chanting during sacrificial rituals. Picture this. Priests gathered around a fire, not with marshmallows but with mantras, as they sang their hearts out to ensure the gods stayed on their good side. This wasn't casual karaoke night. It was a vital part of religious ceremonies, with the tunes acting as a direct line to the divine. Talk about high stakes. But let's not get too misty-eyed over the sacred sing-along. While the Samaveda was all about those divine vibes, it also involved instruments that would make even the most patient neighbor consider moving to a different galaxy. Take the veena, for instance. This string instrument, which required a certain dexterity to play, was the ancient equivalent of trying to master a guitar solo while simultaneously balancing on a unicycle. Then there were the drums, like the dundubby, a beast of an instrument that could probably double as a battering ram. Subtlety, it seems, wasn't at the top of the playlist. In terms of social context, music in the Vedic age was an exclusive affair. It wasn't just any Tom, Dick or Harry who could pick up a veena and start strumming. These performances were the domain of the Brahmins, the priestly caste, who had the monopoly on these divine frequencies. If you were a commoner, your best shot at joining the musical elite was catching a glimpse of these rituals from a distance and maybe humming along quietly so as not to upset the cosmic balance or the priests. The Samavada's influence stretched beyond just the religious sphere. It laid the groundwork for what would eventually become the classical music of India. Think of it as the granddaddy of genres like Hindustani and Carnatic music, which would evolve in the centuries to follow. And while it's tempting to romanticize these early days as a harmonious golden age of music, let's not ignore the reality that this was serious business. Get a note wrong, and you might just find yourself on the wrong side of a deity's wrath. No pressure. Historically speaking, the Vedic age was a time when music and dance were inseparable from rituals and religion. This wasn't just a cultural preference, it was a cosmic necessity. The idea was that the universe itself was a harmony of sounds, and humans needed to mirror this through their own musical endeavors. This belief was so entrenched that the very word samavada can be translated to mean the knowledge of melodies, highlighting just how integral these hymns were to the spiritual and cultural fabric of the time. And it's not like the Vedic age had a monopoly on cosmic tunes. Other parts of the world were also figuring out that music wasn't just for livening up a dull afternoon. However, the meticulous way in which the Samaveda integrated music with spiritual practice was something uniquely Indian, setting a precedent for the rich tapestry of musical traditions that would unfurl over the centuries. So, the next time you plug in your headphones and shuffle through your favorite playlist, spare a thought for those ancient Vedic priests. They didn't have the luxury of a skips button when a hymn wasn't quite to their liking. Instead, they had to get it right the first time, every time. Their audience, after all, was a bit more demanding than the average crowd at a concert. They were performing for the gods themselves. And so, from divine hymnals to everyday jams, into the classical age of Indian music, a time when the air was thick with not just incense but innovation. Picture the subcontinent as a vast, sonorous laboratory where musical alchemists were busy crafting the elixirs we now know as Carnatic and Hindustani music. These weren't just styles, they were entire ecosystems of sound, each with its own rules, legends, and yes, even its own version of musical Sudoku, the raga system. Now, if you think Sudoku's a headache, try wrapping your head around a raga. We're talking about musical frameworks that dictate everything from the notes you can play to the emotional roller coaster you're supposed to evoke. There are literally hundreds of ragas, each with its own personality. Some are morning people, others are night owls. It's like having a wardrobe full of outfits where each is only suitable for a specific mood and time of day. In the Carnatic tradition alone, there are 72 parent scales called malakatas, and from these, countless ragas sprout like musical offspring. Think of it as the original choose-your-own adventure, but with melodies. But why all this complexity? Well, my friends, it was all about making music matter. This was an era when sound was seen as a pathway to the divine, a language that could convey emotions where words fell short. Imagine the raga system as a finely tuned social media algorithm designed to connect human souls directly with cosmic forces. It was both a science and an art, a method and a madness. And speaking of madness, let's talk about the kings and their courts. These rulers weren't just about land grabs and palace intrigue, they were the original patrons of the arts, the Medici of the East. Picture a king like Krishna-Devaraya of the Vijayanagara Empire in the 16th century. His court was a who's who of musical and literary talent, a veritable Renaissance fair minus the turkey legs. The king wasn't just a fan, he was a curator of culture, doling out patronage like likes on an Instagram post. But why were these kings so keen on sponsoring bards and dancers? Simple: reputation. In a world without Twitter followers or YouTube subscribers, having a court buzzing with artistic talent was the ultimate status symbol. It was the medieval equivalent of having your face on the cover of Forbes. The more skilled your court musicians, the more enlightened you appeared. And let's be honest, who wouldn't want to be remembered as an enlightened patron rather than a garden variety tyrant? Of course, this artistic sponsorship wasn't just about vanity. It was also a savvy political move. By investing in the arts, kings could unite their diverse subjects under a shared cultural banner. Music, dance, and poetry became tools for political cohesion. a way to create a national identity long before the concept even existed. It was cultural diplomacy at its finest. But let's not gloss over the economics here. The arts weren't just a drain on the royal treasury, they were also a lucrative business. Festivals, performances and temple ceremonies drew crowds, and where there are crowds, there's commerce. Musicians and dancers were professionals, often well paid for their contributions. Temples, which were the epicenters of cultural life, served as both spiritual hubs and economic engines, driving trade and tourism in the way only a five-star pilgrimage can. Yet, despite all this grandeur, the classical age wasn't all sitars and sunshine. The life of a court musician could be precarious. Patronage was fickle, subject to the whims of rulers and the vagaries of politics. A change in leadership could mean a change in artistic direction, leaving musicians scrambling like actors at a cancelled TV show. Moreover, while kings and nobles indulged in musical opulence, the common folk often faced harsher realities, living in a world where survival took precedence over symphonies. And speaking of harsh realities, let's debunk a romantic myth, the idea that ancient Indian music was purely a divine pursuit, unsullied by worldly concerns. Sure, the ragas were spiritual in nature, but let's not pretend they were above a little earthly ambition. The musicians of the age were as human as anyone else, navigating a world of court politics, rivalries, and personal ambitions. They weren't just playing for the gods, they were also playing for dinner. So, as we leave this chapter of India's musical saga, let's appreciate both the romance and the reality. The classical age was a time of incredible artistic flourishing, yes, but also strategic patronage and economic pragmatism. It was a world where music was both a celestial language and a courtly tool, a divine gift and a human endeavour. And as we prepare to dive even deeper into this rich tapestry of sound and story, remember, in the world of Indian classical music, the melody is only half the story. Just wait until we get to the rhythm. As we pivot from the symphonic sagas of ancient India, let's swivel our spotlight onto something equally mesmerizing: dance. Forget the TikTok routines and Instagram reels. We're talking Bharatanatyam and Kathak, forms of dance that were like the ancient world's version of a Netflix drama, sacred, scandalous, and binge-worthy. These weren't just performances, they were rituals, storytelling in motion, and at times a tad bit controversial. Let's start with Bharatanatyam, the prima ballerina of Indian classical dance. Born in the temples of Tamil Nadu, Bharatanatyam was where art met devotion, a spiritual practice as much as a physical one. Imagine it as yoga with a side of storytelling. Dancers didn't just move, they conveyed epics, emotions, and even ethical dilemmas through a complex system of gestures and expressions. It's said that Bharatanatyam was codified in texts like the Natya Shastra around 200 BCE, a heavy-duty tome that made sure every step and gesture was as precise as a Swiss watch. But before you envision a serene scene of temple tranquility, let's dive into the reality check. The stage for many Bharatanatyam dancers was the temple, yes, but also the courts and sometimes rather unsavory venues. Enter the Devadasis, women who were married to the deities, a respectable gig in theory with a job description that included singing, dancing, and maintaining temple rituals. In practice, however, this often translated to living conditions that were just a few notches above those of an overworked intern. The Devadasi system was a product of its economic and social milieu. During the peak of this tradition, around the 9th to 13th centuries, Devadasis were patronized by kings and wealthy nobles who saw their support as both a religious duty and a status symbol. After all, a king with a temple full of Devadasis was like a modern-day mogul with a private art collection. But when royal attention waned, Devadasis found themselves navigating a precarious existence, balancing on the tightrope of devotion and survival. And yes, that sometimes involved less than sacred engagements, a reality often glossed over in romanticized retellings. On the other side of the subcontinent, the Kathak dancers were spinning tales of their own. Originating in the northern regions, Kathak was the storytelling dance par excellence, with roots reaching back to 400 BCE. These dances were the human equivalent of ancient bards, weaving myths and legends through intricate footwork and swift spins. Kathak was the original binge watch, with performances that could last all night, telling the Mahabharata or Ramayana in episodic grandeur. But just like its southern cousin, Kathak had its own set of challenges. These dances were not confined to temples. They entertained in royal courts and the bustling bazaars. By the 15th and 16th centuries, under the Mughal influence, Kathak underwent a transformation, incorporating Persian elements and becoming a courtly art. This was Kathak 2.0, with added glam and a hint of scandal. The Mughal emperors were patrons, yes, but they also imposed a layer of courtly politics, where allegiances could shift faster than a Kathak dancer's pirouette. Economically, dance was a double-edged sword. On one hand, it was a lucrative profession under the right patronage. Temple festivals and royal courts paid handsomely for top-tier performances, and dancers could amass wealth, albeit with strings attached. But the moment a patron fell out of power or favour, well, it was back to square one. Dancers had to be as adept in navigating social networks as they were in executing a flawless spin. Now, let's debunk a popular myth. The idea that these dancers led lives of luxury and leisure, basking in the glow of divine approval. Sure, there were moments of grandeur, but the reality was more akin to a soap opera. The Devadasis and Kathak dancers were often pawns in the political chess games of their patrons. A change in regime could mean a complete upheaval of their world, leaving them to fend for themselves in a society that wasn't exactly rolling out the red carpet. Yet, despite these challenges, Bharatanatyam and Kathak thrived, evolving into the iconic art forms we recognize today. They were resilient, adapting to changing socio-political landscapes like seasoned chameleons. The dancers were not just artists, they were cultural ambassadors, carrying the torch of tradition even as they danced through the fires of political intrigue and economic uncertainty. So, as we waltz through this chapter of history, let's not just admire the grace and beauty of these dance forms, but also acknowledge the grit and tenacity of those who kept them alive. These were not just performers, they were pioneers on a stage set against a backdrop of divine duty and human drama. And as we prepare to delve deeper into the intricate tapestry of India's cultural narrative, remember, in the world of classical dance, every step tells a story, and every story has a truth waiting to be uncovered. As we pirouette away from the mesmerizing world of Bharatanatyam and Kathak, let's shimmy over to how these art forms became the chess pieces in the grand game of empire building. We're diving into the era of the Mughals, where music and dance were not just mere entertainment, they were political stratagems wrapped in silk and gold. First, let's set the stage with the Mughals, the dynasty that knew how to put on a show. Imagine the Mughal courts as the ultimate cultural melting pots where Persian elegance met Indian opulence. If there was a Pinterest board for royal excess, the Mughals would have owned it. Their love for music and dance wasn't just an indulgence, it was a calculated move to establish a cultural identity as rich and layered as their jewel-encrusted thrones. Take Emperor Akbar, the poster child for Mughal grandeur. His court was a who's who of talent, featuring legendary musicians like Tansen, whose voice was said to light lamps and bring rain. Now, while we're on the myth-busting train, let's debunk the idea that Tansen was just a musical wizard with supernatural abilities. Sure, it's a charming tale, but the truth is, Akbar's patronage turned Tansen into a cultural icon, a political tool to unite the diverse peoples of his empire under a shared appreciation for music. Akbar wasn't just playing the lute, he was playing a strategic game. By integrating local art forms with Persian influences, he created a sense of unity, a single cultural tapestry that could weave together the diverse threads of his empire. This wasn't just about aesthetics, it was about power. Art became a medium of soft governance, a way to build allegiance through awe and admiration rather than fear and force. But the Mughals weren't done yet. Fast forward to Shah Jahan, the emperor who gifted the world the Taj Mahal, a love letter in marble. His reign saw the rise of courtly Kathak performances, which had evolved from temple rituals to sophisticated court spectacles. Kathak dancers, with their intricate footwork and expressive storytelling, became ambassadors of Mughal culture, showcasing the empire's refined tastes and sophistication. Yet, behind the glamour lay a harsh reality. The dancers and musicians were subject to the whims of their patrons, their fates tied to the volatile tides of court politics. A misplaced step or an off-key note could mean falling from grace faster than you could say Mughal miniatures. And let's not sugarcoat the economics here. Patronage was as much about political allegiance as it was about artistic merit. Musicians and dancers had to be as savvy in court intrigue as they were skilled in their crafts. Speaking of intrigue, let's waltz over to the British colonial era, where things got a bit awkward. The British, in their imperial wisdom, decided that Indian classical music and dance were a touch too exotics for their sensibilities. Enter the push for cultural suppression, a misguided attempt to civilize the subcontinent by undermining its indigenous art forms. But suppressing a culture as vibrant as India's was like trying to bottle a monsoon. It simply wasn't going to happen. The British may have attempted to stifle traditional performances, but they inadvertently fueled a renaissance. As they cracked down on temple dancers and musicians, these artists found new venues and audiences, transforming adversity into artistic innovation. One of the most infamous moves by the British was the anti-Nautch movement in the late 19th century, which targeted the Devadasis and aimed to eradicate their dance traditions. It was a classic case of moral policing, couched in the language of reform but driven by cultural snobbery. This movement painted the Devadasis as morally corrupt, conveniently ignoring their historical role as custodians of temple art and music. It was like trying to delete a chapter of history with a red pen of hypocrisy. Yet, out of this cultural clash emerged a new era of resilience. Indian music and dance adapted, finding new expressions in nationalistic movements that sought to reclaim cultural identity. The very art forms the British sought to suppress became tools of resistance and symbols of a burgeoning national consciousness. Artists like Rukmini Devi Arundale, who championed the revival of Bharatanatyam and the efforts to preserve and promote Indian classical music, were instrumental in this cultural resurgence. In a twist of irony, the British colonial era, initially marked by suppression, inadvertently laid the groundwork for a cultural renaissance. The music and dance they sought to control became powerful symbols of resistance, embodying a spirit that could not be silenced by imperial decree. It was a testament to the enduring power of art, a reminder that while rulers come and go, culture has a way of outlasting them all. So, as we dance through this historical saga, let's appreciate the role of music and dance as both tools and shields in the grand theatre of politics. From Mughal courts to colonial cat-and-mouse games, these art forms have been at the heart of India's cultural narrative, shaping and reshaping identities in ways that defy simple categorization. And as we prepare to delve deeper into this rich tapestry of sound and story, remember, in the world of Indian music and dance, the stage is always set for the unexpected. As the curtain falls on the colonial era, let's pivot to the dazzling modern resurgence of Indian music and dance. We're talking about a revival that's less stuffy museum and more global sensation, where ancient rhythms meet digital streams and classical ragas get tangled in the chords of a Bollywood blockbuster. First, let's give a nod to Bollywood, the juggernaut of pop culture that's been turning traditional Indian arts into global phenomena since the 1930s. Bollywood has done for Indian music and dance what emojis did for communication, made them universally accessible. Imagine the scene, a traditional Kathak dancer spinning onto the screen, seamlessly transitioning into a high-energy number with beats that even the most rhythmically challenged can't resist tapping their feet to. This isn't just fusion, it's a cultural mashup on a grand scale, where the ancient and the modern cha-cha together, defying time and tradition. The numbers speak volumes. Bollywood produces over 1,000 films a year, each with its own soundtrack, and these are not just run-of-the-mill jingles. We're talking about chart toppers that blend classical Indian music with contemporary sounds, reaching audiences in over 90 countries. It's like a buffet where the sitar and synthesizer share the same plate, and everyone leaves with a happy heart and an even happier playlist. But Bollywood is just the tip of the iceberg. Dive deeper into the digital age, and you'll find that ancient Indian music and dance are not just surviving, they're thriving. Platforms like YouTube and Spotify have become the new temples where these art forms are worshipped. A Bharatanatyam performance uploaded from Chennai can go viral in minutes, attracting viewers from Boston to Beijing. It's a far cry from the temple courts of yore, yet the essence remains the same, connecting people through the universal language of art. And let's not forget the economic impact here. The Indian music industry is valued at around 300 million, with digital music accounting for over 70% of revenue. This isn't just a nod to nostalgia, it's a booming business that's as much about bytes as it is about beats. Classical music festivals, once exclusive to cultural connoisseurs, are now streaming live to thousands of viewers worldwide, proving that the appeal of a raga is as timeless as it is borderless. But while the digital age has democratized access, it's also been a double-edged sword. The very platforms that have made these art forms accessible have also opened the floodgates to cultural appropriation and commercialization. It's like inviting everyone to a potluck, where some guests forget to bring a dish, but are more than happy to help themselves to the feast. Yet, in this chaotic dance of cultural exchange, there's a silver lining, a renewed interest and respect for the roots of these traditions, prompting collaborations that honor rather than exploit their origins. Now, let's bust a myth that's as persistent as a catchy tune, the notion that modern interpretations dilute the purity of classical forms. Sure, purists might scoff at a Bollywood remix of a centuries-old raga, but let's face it, evolution is the name of the game. Art, much like life, thrives on adaptability. It's not about replacing the old with the new, it's about creating a dialogue between them. The raga that once reverberated in a temple now finds a second life on a global stage, proving that tradition can coexist with innovation, each enriching the other. In this ever-evolving landscape, what's truly remarkable is the tenacity of those who continue to champion these ancient traditions. Whether it's the dance schools in New York offering Kathak classes, or the music festivals in London featuring Carnatic concerts, the legacy of Indian music and dance is carried forward by a dedicated community of artists and enthusiasts. They're the modern-day torchbearers, ensuring these art forms remain as relevant as they are revered. In the end, the story of Indian music and dance is a testament to the power of cultural resilience. From Vedic chants to viral videos, from temple rituals to TikTok trends, these art forms have navigated the currents of history with grace and grit. They remind us that while the world around us may change, the human spirit's capacity for expression and connection endures. And as we step off this historical stage, let's carry with us the melodies and movements that have echoed through the ages, leaving an indelible mark on the tapestry of time. So the next time you find yourself lost in a YouTube rabbit hole or humming along to a Bollywood tune, remember, you're part of a story that's been centuries in the making, a dance that never truly ends. Byzantium, where the extravagance of the court ceremonies could make even the most lavish modern wedding look like a backyard barbecue. At the zenith of its power, the Byzantine Empire wasn't just a footnote in history, it was the foot-stomping, drum-beating lead guitarist of the medieval world, complete with its own pyrotechnic show. But before we get tangled in the dazzle of court life, let's set the stage with the splendor of Constantinople, the empire's glittering capital. Constantinople, or as we might call it in today's terms, the OG city of bling, was where Europe met Asia, both geographically and culturally. Imagine a city where the skyline was dominated by the Great Dome of the Hagia Sophia, a marvel of engineering that had architects scratching their heads and saying, "How on earth did they pull that off?" Completed in 537 AD, the Hagia Sophia wasn't just a church, it was a statement piece, a declaration that Byzantium was the heavyweight champion of architectural innovation. Its massive dome, measuring about 102 feet in diameter, seemed to defy gravity, floating above the city like a celestial crown. This was a place where emperors were crowned, where the spiritual met the political in a grand cosmic dance. But the Hagia Sophia was just the crown jewel in a city filled with architectural wonders. The Great Palace of Constantinople, sprawling over some 200,000 square feet, was the nerve center of imperial power. It was the kind of place where "go big or go home" was likely coined. Its halls were lined with opulent mosaics and frescoes, the floors paved with intricate marble designs that would make any Pinterest board look tame. The palace complex was a veritable city within a city, complete with its own chapels, gardens, and even a hippodrome for chariot racing, because why not? However, all this opulence came with a price tag that would make even the most spendthrift emperor wince. Maintaining the grandeur of the Byzantine court required a fortune, and the empire's treasury was like a bottomless pit where gold and silver disappeared faster than you could say imperial budget. The Byzantine bureaucracy was a finely tuned machine, with a hierarchy that would put any modern corporation to shame. The emperor sat at the top of this pyramid, a living god in the eyes of his subjects, surrounded by a court of nobles and officials who knew that their place in the pecking order was crucial to their survival. The court ceremonies themselves were elaborate affairs, a blend of Roman pomp and Eastern mysticism. They were carefully choreographed spectacles designed to reinforce the divine right of the emperor to rule. The emperor's entrance into a ceremony was a theatrical event, complete with a full entourage and the kind of pageantry that could rival a Broadway production. Picture this, the emperor, draped in robes of purple silk, the colour reserved exclusively for royalty, wearing a crown encrusted with jewels that sparkled like a disco ball under the Byzantine sun. But while the emperor and his inner circle were busy flaunting their wealth, the rest of the empire was busy footing the bill. The economic realities of maintaining such an extravagant lifestyle were anything but glamorous. The Byzantine tax system was notoriously complex, a Byzantine labyrinth, pun intended, of tariffs, tributes and levies that could baffle even the most seasoned accountant. The tax burden on the average citizen was staggering, and it often fell to the peasantry and middle class to fill the imperial coffers. These folks weren't exactly living in luxury. They were more concerned with keeping a roof over their heads and food on the table. The contrast between the gilded halls of the great palace and the humble homes of the empire's citizens was as stark as night and day. While the elites were gorging on delicacies like peacock and sturgeon, the average Byzantine was more likely to be dining on bread and onions. And yet, despite the economic disparities, the allure of the court remained irresistible. There was something almost magical about the Byzantine ceremonies, a reminder that even in times of hardship, the human spirit is drawn to beauty and spectacle. In the end, the Byzantine court ceremonies were a reflection of the empire itself, an intricate tapestry woven from threads of power, faith, and ambition. They were a microcosm of a world where the divine and the earthly were inextricably linked, where emperors were both rulers and symbols of a celestial order. And while the grandeur of Byzantium might have faded with time, the echoes of its courtly magnificence continue to captivate our imaginations, a testament to an age where the line between reality and legend was as thin as the silk robes of an emperor. Now that we've admired the grandeur of Byzantium's court, it's time to dive into the main event, the Byzantine coronation ceremonies. If you thought planning a modern wedding was stressful, imagine orchestrating a spectacle that needed to convince an entire empire that the new emperor wasn't just another guy in a shiny hat, but a divinely chosen ruler. This was the Super Bowl of ceremonial events, complete with its own halftime show of incense and hymns. The Byzantine coronation was a marathon, not a sprint. We're talking about a day-long affair that started at the crack of dawn and wrapped up only when the last candle flickered out. It kicked off at the Hagia Sophia, that architectural marvel we mentioned earlier, which served as both the spiritual and literal starting point for the new emperor's reign. The Patriarch of Constantinople, the ecclesiastical heavyweight of the time, played a starring role in this ceremony, and his blessing was crucial for the emperor's legitimacy. This was no mere nod and handshake, it was a full-on liturgical extravaganza. The emperor was anointed with holy oil, a symbolic gesture borrowed from the Old Testament kings of Israel, confirming that he was not just another ambitious noble, but one chosen by divine will. And let's not forget the crown itself, a piece of headgear that could make Liberace swoon. The crown's design evolved over time, but it was always a glittering mass of jewels and gold that probably weighed as much as a small child. It wasn't just plopped on the emperor's head either, no. This was a carefully choreographed moment, akin to the dropping of the New Year's Eve ball in Times Square, complete with chants and cheers from the assembled clergy and nobility. But before you start thinking this was all about solemnity and grandeur, let's add a little reality check. Behind the pomp and circumstance, there was a lot of politicking going on. The Byzantine Empire was a place where power was as slippery as a greased pig at a country fair. Many emperors were raised to the throne not by divine selection, but by a mixture of military might, political maneuvering, and, occasionally, sheer luck. The idea of the emperor as God's chosen one was a narrative that served to keep the peace and maintain order, a bit like telling everyone that the office coffee machine is blessed to keep people from stealing it. Our sources on these ceremonies, like the writings of the historian and courtier Constantine VII, offer us a peek behind the silk curtains. Constantine, who reigned in the 10th century, detailed these events with the kind of precision you'd expect from someone who knew the importance of keeping up appearances. According to his accounts, every gesture was laden with symbolism, from the emperor's procession through the streets of Constantinople to the elaborate banquet that followed, where the new ruler would break bread with his closest allies and, occasionally, his most dangerous rivals. Now, about that banquet, it was the kind of feast that could put a Roman orgy to shame. Picture tables groaning under the weight of roasted meats, exotic fruits, and enough wine to float a small navy. Yet this wasn't just about indulging in the good life. The banquet served as a political tool, a way to solidify alliances and showcase the emperor's wealth and generosity. Two things that were absolutely vital in a world where the next coup could be just around the corner. Of course, the whole divine right narrative had its appeal. It was a convenient way to keep the masses in line, as well as a comforting story for the emperors themselves who, let's face it, probably needed a bit of reassurance given their precarious positions. But peel back the layers of this gilded tale, and you'll find a harsh reality. The Byzantine throne was a seat with no seatbelt, and the ride was anything but smooth. Let's talk numbers for a second. The Byzantine Empire at its height controlled vast territories, from Italy to the Middle East, which meant that the emperor had to be more than a ceremonial figurehead. He was a military leader, an economic strategist, and a political mastermind, juggling the needs of diverse peoples and cultures. The coronation was just the beginning of a career that could end in glory, or, more often than not, in exile, assassination, or blinding, a favourite Byzantine punishment, believe it or not. So, why did they bother with all the theatrics? Well, much like today's celebrity culture, image was everything. A successful coronation sent a clear message: this guy is in charge, and he's got both God and the church on speed dial. But it was also about continuity, a way to link the present to the grand traditions of Rome and to reassure everyone that despite the chaos, the empire was still the axis around which the world turned. In the end, the Byzantine coronation ceremonies were more than just rituals. They were acts of political theatre, designed to cement the emperor's authority in the minds of his subjects. They combined the sacred and the secular in a way that left no doubt about who was at the top of the world's most elaborate pecking order. And while the divine right may have been a comforting narrative, the reality was that an emperor's power was only as strong as the alliances he could forge and the enemies he could outmaneuver. As we wrap up this leg of our journey through the Byzantine spectacle, keep in mind that all this pageantry was just a precursor to the real work of ruling an empire. In the next part, we'll delve into the daily grind of being a Byzantine emperor. Spoiler alert, it involves a lot more than sitting on a throne looking regal. Stay tuned for more tales from the Byzantine court, where power, politics, and the occasional peacock feast were all in a day's work. Before we dive into the nitty-gritty of what it was like to be a Byzantine emperor on the daily grind, let's just say that the role involved much more than lounging around in silk togas while being fed grapes. Think of it more like being the CEO of a multinational corporation that had to occasionally fend off hostile takeovers, sometimes literally. Now, let's talk about one of the more peculiar rituals that defined daily court life, proskynesis. This wasn't some ancient Zumba class. It was a form of deep bowing that was part of a complex choreography of court etiquette. Proskynesis, which has roots in Persian court traditions, was essentially a full-body kowtow. Picture this: courtiers bending low, nearly kissing the ground, to show their submission and reverence to the emperor. It was less about flexibility and more about reinforcing the social hierarchy, making sure everyone knew who was boss. The political significance of proskynesis was enormous. It was a daily reminder that the emperor wasn't just the guy in the big chair, he was the center of the universe, the sun around which the Byzantine solar system revolved. Every bow was a small act of political theatre, reinforcing the emperor's image as a semi-divine figure. It maintained the illusion of stability and order in a realm where palatial intrigue was as common as baklava at a Greek wedding. But why go to such lengths for a bit of bowing, you ask? Well, in a world where the throne was as stable as a wobbly chair, reinforcing authority was crucial. These daily rituals were like the emperor's PR campaign, a way to project power and command respect without uttering a single word. It was about as subtle as a sledgehammer, but effective in keeping the courtiers in line. And let's not forget the economic context. Running a court with such elaborate ceremonies wasn't cheap. We're talking about a system where the price of the emperor's wardrobe alone could probably fund a small army. The Byzantine treasury had to foot the bill for everything from silk garments to lavish banquets, not to mention the salaries of countless officials and servants who kept the imperial machine humming. The funds had to come from somewhere, and that somewhere was often the empire's heavily taxed populace. The economic divide was a chasm, with the court's extravagance serving as both a symbol of power and a constant reminder of social inequality. Of course, these ceremonies served a dual purpose. They weren't just about keeping the emperor's image polished, they also provided a semblance of order in the chaotic world of Byzantine politics. The empire was a patchwork quilt of cultures, languages, and religions, and maintaining unity was a Herculean task. The court rituals, with their rigid hierarchies and formalities, offered a sense of continuity and stability, even if it was only skin deep. But let's not romanticize it too much. The Byzantine court was a hive of intrigue, with plots and counterplots buzzing like agitated bees. The rituals, while grand, were often a smokescreen for the power struggles simmering beneath the surface. Behind every bow and proclamation of loyalty could lurk an ambitious noble, dreaming of the day they might swap their courtly robes for imperial purple. And what about the emperor himself? He had to walk a fine line, balancing the demands of tradition with the harsh realities of ruling an empire constantly under threat from both external invasions and internal dissent. The ceremonies might have projected an image of unassailable power, but the reality was often a high-stakes game of political chess, where one wrong move could lead to a swift downfall. In the grand scheme of things, the Byzantine court rituals were more than just pageantry. They were the glue holding the empire together, a carefully crafted illusion of power and stability. Yet, beneath the glittering surface lay a world of uncertainty, where the emperor's fate was as unpredictable as the tides of the Bosporus. As we delve deeper into the Byzantine court, remember that these rituals, while fascinating, were part of a much larger story, a story of power, survival, and the relentless struggle to maintain an empire in a world constantly shifting beneath its feet. Stay tuned as we continue to peel back the layers of this complex tapestry, revealing the human drama that lay at the heart of the Byzantine saga. So, as we peel back the layers of Byzantine pomp and pageantry, let's dive into the diplomatic shindigs that made the court ceremonies look like a dress rehearsal. In the Byzantine Empire, diplomacy wasn't just about sending a polite note in a fruit basket, it was a full-blown theatrical production. When foreign dignitaries came knocking, the Byzantines rolled out the red, or should I say, the purple carpet. This was not just any old rug, it was a symbol of imperial power, dyed with the famously expensive Tyrian purple, extracted from thousands of sea snails. Talk about being fashionably late to the party. Now, why such a fuss, you ask? Well, in a world where a handshake could mean the difference between war and peace, the Byzantines understood that first impressions were everything. The diplomatic ceremonies were a masterclass in soft power, a way to show the world that Byzantium was the ultimate VIP lounge of medieval geopolitics. The empire was the grand maestro, orchestrating a symphony of political theatre, making sure every note hit just the right level of opulence and awe. Let's take a walk through one of these ceremonies, where foreign dignitaries were greeted with an extravagant display of Byzantine hospitality. Picture this. The dignitaries would enter the great palace, their eyes greeted by the shimmering mosaics and marble columns that seemed to whisper tales of imperial grandeur. They'd be led through corridors adorned with silk draperies, the kind that could bankrupt a small kingdom just a touch. And at the centre of it all was the emperor, seated on a throne that was less a piece of furniture and more a blinged-out statement of divine favour. The Byzantines were nothing if not detail-oriented. According to the 10th century book De Ceremoniis by Emperor Constantine VII, the ceremonial protocol was outlined with the precision of a Swiss watch. Every step, every gesture was choreographed to convey the empire's might and sophistication. The dignitaries were treated to lavish banquets, where they dined on delicacies like pheasant served on gold platters and washed it all down with wine that flowed more freely than compliments at a royal wedding. Of course, the Byzantines had more up their sleeves than just culinary delights. The pièce de résistance of these ceremonies was the mechanical throne room. Legend has it that the emperor's throne could rise and fall, while gilded lions flanked it, roaring, thanks to a bit of medieval engineering magic. This wasn't just for show, it was psychological warfare wrapped in a velvet glove. The message was clear. Byzantium was a realm where even the furniture was more powerful than you. But beyond the glitz and glamour, these ceremonies were strategic PR campaigns. They allowed Byzantium to project an image of stability and opulence to the world, crucial for an empire that was as much a target as it was a power player. And it wasn't just about dazzling the foreigners. These events were a chance to form alliances, negotiate treaties, and sometimes even broker marriages. It was diplomacy wrapped in a toga with a side of theatrical flair. Let's not forget the economic context. Pulling off such spectacles required a treasury that could rival Smaug's hoard. The Byzantines were expert jugglers of their finances, relying on a combination of taxes, trade tariffs, and tributes from vassal states to keep the coffers full. The empire's strategic location, straddling key trade routes, was a cash cow that funded these grandiose displays. But like any economy built on display, it was a delicate balance. One bad harvest, one military defeat, and the whole house of cards could come tumbling down. And what did the foreign dignitaries think of all this? Primary sources offer us a glimpse. A famous account by Liudprand of Cremona, a 10th century Italian bishop, paints a vivid picture of his ambassadorship to Constantinople. While he was clearly impressed by the lavish receptions, he also noted the underlying tension and the Byzantine knack for playing their cards close to the chest. It was a world where appearances mattered more than reality, and the Byzantines were maestros of the masquerade. But let's not get too swept away by the romance of it all. Behind the silk curtains and gold-threaded tapestries, the Byzantine court was a hotbed of intrigue. Power games were the order of the day, with factions vying for influence and the emperor constantly on guard against plots. The ceremonies, while dazzling, were also a smokescreen, a way to distract from the undercurrents of political maneuvering that ran as deep as the Bosporus itself. In short, the Byzantine diplomatic ceremonies were more than just extravagant parties. They were a tool of statecraft, a means of wielding power without drawing a sword. They allowed Byzantium to punch above its weight on the international stage, maintaining its status as a cultural and political powerhouse long after the Western Roman Empire had crumbled into history. Yet, for all their splendor, these events also revealed the empire's vulnerability, a need to constantly reaffirm its place in a world that was always one step away from chaos. As we close this chapter, remember that the Byzantine Empire was a realm where the line between reality and illusion was as blurred as the shimmering mosaics in the Hagia Sophia. The diplomatic ceremonies were a testament to Byzantium's enduring allure and its ceaseless struggle to maintain its grip on power. And if you thought this was the end of the Byzantine saga, think again. There's more intrigue, more drama, and yes, more peacocks to feast on as we continue to unravel the stories of this fascinating empire. Stay tuned for more tales of Byzantine splendor and the gritty reality that lay beneath its golden veneer. So, we've waltzed through the splendor and spectacle of Byzantine diplomacy, but let's not forget that every gilded veneer eventually cracks. By the time the empire stumbled into its twilight years, those lavish court ceremonies started looking more like a faded Instagram filter trying to cover up the crumbling reality underneath. Sure, the Byzantines had their heyday, but even the best parties must end, especially when the budget's blown and the neighbors start complaining. By the 11th century, the Byzantine Empire was feeling the pinch. The treasury, once a bottomless pit of riches, was starting to resemble an overdrawn checking account. The empire's boundaries were shrinking faster than wool socks in a hot dryer, thanks to a perfect storm of economic pressures and external threats. The Seljuks were crashing the Eastern Gate, the Normans were nosing around Italy, and the Crusaders were less holy warriors and more uninvited house guests. With all these headaches, throwing extravagant ceremonies became as practical as hosting a black-tie gala during a power outage. The imperial court had to downsize its grandeur. Gone were the days when the emperor could make even Liberace look understated. Now, they were lucky if their robes had a hint of purple, let alone enough jewels to blind a man at 20 paces. But let's take a step back and ask, why did these ceremonies matter so much anyway? Well, in the Byzantine world, image was everything. The pomp and circumstance weren't just for show. They were the glue that held the empire's identity together. In a realm that was a cultural melting pot, ceremony served as a reminder of continuity, a way to assert stability in an increasingly unstable world. Think of them as the empire's way of saying, hey, we're still here and we're still fabulous, even if the seams were starting to show. Now, as the empire's finances dwindled, so did its ability to maintain these traditions. The grand rituals that once enchanted foreign dignitaries and kept the nobility in line were stripped back, reduced to shadows of their former glory. The Byzantine court had to make do with less, and the ceremonies became more about maintaining the illusion of power rather than the reality. It was a bit like insisting you have an in-ground pool when it's really just a kiddie pool in the backyard. But the decline in ceremonial grandeur wasn't just about empty pockets. It was also a response to a changing world. The Byzantine Empire was no longer the undisputed heavyweight champion of the medieval ring. With the rise of new powers, like the Ottoman Turks, the Byzantines had to adapt or risk becoming yesterday's news. The court ceremonies, while still important, couldn't mask the empire's waning influence. Let's not sugarcoat it, the empire's later years were rough. The Fourth Crusade in 1204 was a sucker punch that left Constantinople reeling. The city was sacked, and the Byzantine Empire was carved up like a holiday turkey. The Latin Empire set up shop in Constantinople, and while the Byzantines would eventually claw their way back, the damage was done. The empire that emerged was a shadow of its former self, with ceremonies that were more nostalgic than impressive. Yet, for all their decline, these ceremonies left a lasting legacy. They influenced the courts of Europe, where the Byzantine flair for spectacle found eager imitators. Even today, echoes of Byzantine pomp can be seen in modern statecraft. Consider the elaborate rituals of the British monarchy or the pageantry of state visits. These are the descendants of a tradition that valued ceremony as a tool of diplomacy and power. In a way, the Byzantine Empire was the original masterclass in public relations. Their court ceremonies were an early example of branding, long before social media turned everyone into self-styled influencers. The Byzantines knew that the story you tell is just as important as the reality you live, a lesson that resonates even in our digital age. But as we wrap up our journey through the Byzantine court, let's not forget the human element. Behind the glittering mosaics and ceremonial robes were real people, grappling with the timeless struggles of power, identity, and survival. The Byzantines may have been masters of illusion, but they were also pioneers of a political theatre that continues to captivate us. Their legacy is a reminder that history is as much about stories as it is about facts, a rich tapestry of triumphs and tragedies, woven with threads of human ambition and folly. So, the next time you find yourself caught up in the drama of modern politics or the allure of a royal wedding, spare a thought for the Byzantines. They were the original architects of spectacle, the grand masters of ceremony, and their influence still echoes through the corridors of power. In the end, the Byzantine court was more than just a stage. It was a mirror reflecting the complexities of the human condition, a testament to an empire that danced on the edge of legend and reality. Mohenjo-daro, where the past throws a killer party that modern architects still dream of crashing. This ancient city, nestled in the Indus Valley, was the VIP section of ancient urban planning around 2000 BCE. If cities had personalities, Mohenjo-daro was the rock star strutting on the prehistoric stage, while the rest of the world was busy trying to figure out how to not live in mud huts. Let's talk geography for a second. Mohenjo-daro was sitting pretty in what is now Pakistan, smack in the middle of the Indus Valley. This wasn't just some random spot on the map, it was prime real estate. Imagine beachfront property without the threat of tsunamis, okay? Maybe just a couple of 1,000-year floods. It was the perfect location for commerce and agriculture, sitting between the Indus River and the Ghaggar-Hakra River system. The region was a crossroads for trade routes that were the ancient equivalent of a modern-day freeway system. You could almost hear the ancient merchants grumbling about camel traffic jams. Now, unlike the rest of the ancient world, where city planning often looked like a toddler's crayon drawing, Mohenjo-daro was laid out with the precision of a Swiss watch. The city planners didn't just wing it, they had a vision. They carved out a sophisticated grid system that would make any modern urban planner weep with envy. Streets were laid out in perfect rectangles, not the chaotic spaghetti junctions you see in some modern cities. This wasn't just about making it easy to navigate, it was about efficiency, order, and probably showing off a little to neighbouring cities. And let's not even get started on the drainage system. While other civilizations were still figuring out how to not drown in their own filth, Mohenjo-daro was flaunting an advanced sewage system that was light years ahead of its time. We're talking about brick-lined drains and covered sewage channels that ran beneath the streets. It's like the city had its own ancient version of public sanitation, a concept that some places today are still trying to grasp. It's as if the city planners said, you know what would be revolutionary? Not living in a cesspool. Of course, with great planning comes the question, why did it matter? Well, for starters, it meant the city could support a large population with relative ease. We're talking around 40,000 people at its peak, give or take a few who might have wandered off in search of greener pastures or better trade deals. The city's design facilitated trade, communication, and resource management, which was a big deal in an era where those things could make or break a civilization. Not to mention, it kept disease at bay, which was no small feat considering the lack of modern medicine. But let's not romanticize it too much. While it's fun to think of Mohenjo-daro as a utopia of urban planning, the reality wasn't all sunshine and perfectly aligned streets. The strategic location that made it a trade hub also made it a target for invasions. And while the drainage system was impressive, it wasn't immune to blockages and failures, leading to some rather unpleasant scenarios. There were no plumbers to call, after all. And, despite the seemingly egalitarian layout, social stratification was still a thing. The city was divided into the citadel and the lower town, with the former being home to what we can assume were the elite. In many ways, Mohenjo-daro was a city of contradictions. It was advanced yet vulnerable, structured yet susceptible to the whims of nature and politics. But what it undeniably was a testament to the ingenuity and ambition of its people. As we peel back the layers of this ancient wonder, we find a city that was as complex and fascinating as any modern metropolis, proving that even thousands of years ago, humans were capable of extraordinary feats of engineering and organization. And while we might never fully understand all the mysteries of Mohenjo-daro, it's clear that it set a standard for urban living that still resonates today. Now, while we're busy being awestruck by Mohenjo-daro's urban mastery, let's dive into one of its crowning jewels, the Great Bath. Imagine this, a pool so meticulously designed it could make today's luxury spas look like kiddie pools. This architectural marvel wasn't just a big puddle for splashing around, it was a sophisticated structure that screamed, yes, we knew how to pamper ourselves several millennia ago. The Great Bath was about 12 meters long, 7 meters wide, and 2.4 meters deep. A pool with these dimensions today would easily make the shortlist for a 5-star resort. Constructed with watertight bricks and a layer of bitumen, this wasn't just a pit filled with water. It was a well-thought-out aquatic experience. The surrounding colonnades and steps leading down into the bath were the ancient equivalent of poolside cabanas. It wasn't merely a place for taking a dip. It was likely a centre for ritualistic or ceremonial purposes, which adds a layer of mystique and drama to our spa analogy. But let's not kid ourselves. While the romantic idea of ancient rituals is undeniably appealing, it's entirely possible these activities included less glamorous tasks like washing off the grime of day-to-day life. When it came to water management, Mohenjo-daro was playing a different game altogether. The Great Bath was part of a larger, almost obsessive, focus on water management that would make even the most conscientious city planners blush. The city boasted an extraordinary drainage system with covered drains and manholes, which sounds like a mundane detail, until you remember the rest of the world was still figuring out how not to drink from the same river they used as a latrine. This network was more than just a fancy plumbing trick, it was a lifesaver. It helped prevent diseases and, more impressively, kept the city from turning into a swamp every time the sky decided it was in the mood for a downpour. Speaking of rain, let's take a moment to appreciate the foresight these ancient planners had. In modern times, some cities can barely handle a drizzle without turning roads into rivers. Meanwhile, Mohenjo-daro was handling its business with the kind of efficiency that would make modern civil engineers weep into their blueprints. The streets were designed with a slight slope to ensure rainwater didn't just pool and stagnate. It's as if the city planners sat around a table and said, let's not make this a place where you need a canoe to get to your neighbour's house every monsoon season. But here's the kicker. All this brilliance wasn't just for appearances. The advanced water management systems were a testament to the city's priorities. Water was life, quite literally, and controlling it was a matter of survival. The Indus Valley civilization knew that without proper management, they'd be one bad flood away from joining the ranks of forgotten ghost towns. The ancient engineers were meticulous, and their work was a statement, a bold declaration that their society was one that valued order, health, and sustainability. Of course, in the spirit of myth-busting, let's not ignore the reality that even this genius system had its hiccups. While the drainage system was leagues ahead of its time, it wasn't infallible. Blockages happened, and without a team of repairmen just a phone call away, these blockages could lead to some pretty unsavoury conditions. Imagine the neighbourhood committee meetings back then, probably more about who was supposed to clear the drains than planning the next festival. Economically, managing water wasn't just about hygiene, it was about power. Control the water, and you control the agriculture, the trade, the very lifeblood of the city. The fact that Mohenjo-daro could sustain a population of 40,000 people is a testament to its efficient water management. It was a critical factor in their ability to engage in extensive trade networks, exchanging goods like beads, metals, and pottery with far-flung regions, which, for the Indus Valley, was akin to having a robust export economy. In essence, Mohenjo-daro's urban infrastructure was a manifestation of its people's ingenuity, a blend of practicality and sophistication that served their everyday needs while also elevating their cultural practices. The city was a stage where daily life was orchestrated with precision and grandeur. It's no wonder that when modern archaeologists stumbled upon its ruins, they were not only intrigued but genuinely impressed. Mohenjo-daro wasn't just a city that existed, it was a city that thrived, one that danced on the edge of what was possible at the time. This ancient metropolis offers us a mirror to reflect on our own urban challenges. As we delve deeper into its story, it becomes clear that while technology has advanced, the fundamental challenges of urban living remain remarkably consistent. Mohenjo-daro's legacy is a reminder that the pursuit of a well-ordered society, one that respects and harnesses the natural world, is a timeless endeavour. While contemplating Mohenjo-daro's urban ingenuity, let's pivot to its bustling trade networks that were the ancient equivalent of an international bazaar, minus the tourist traps selling authentic relics. Imagine a city where the streets hummed with the chatter of merchants haggling over prices of everything from lapis lazuli to livestock. A veritable ancient Amazon prime, except the delivery involved a camel and a lot of patience. The Indus Valley civilization was a trading powerhouse, a fact underscored by its strategic location. Mohenjo-daro was perfectly situated to serve as a hub for commerce, bridging the distance between the abundant resources of the East and the hungry markets of the West. Archaeologists have unearthed artifacts like beads and pottery that suggest the city traded with far-flung regions such as Mesopotamia, modern-day Iran, and even the distant shores of the Arabian Peninsula. These ancient business people were rolling out trade routes long before the Silk Road was even a glimmer in Marco Polo's eye. Now, here's the kicker. Despite the apparent complexity of their economic system, we have no idea what the folks of Mohenjo-daro called themselves. Yep, that's right. Thanks to their pesky, undeciphered script, we're left guessing the name of the civilization that was trading like it was the Black Friday of the Bronze Age. It's like trying to piece together a jigsaw puzzle when half the pieces are missing and the cat ran off with the box. The script, found inscribed on seals and pottery, comprises around 400 symbols, none of which have been cracked despite the best efforts of linguists and cryptographers. It's the linguistic equivalent of an IKEA manual without the diagrams. Frustratingly complex and liable to make you question your life choices. Economically, the people of Mohenjo-daro were pioneers, setting up a system that hinged on both agriculture and trade. While the fertile lands around the Indus River provided ample crops like wheat and barley, the city also thrived on its ability to export unique goods. Picture beads as the haute couture of the ancient world, with Mohenjo-daro's artisans crafting intricate designs that were all the rage in distant lands. It's as if they cornered the market on ancient bling, making sure everyone from Ur to Sumer was accessorized in Indus Valley chic. Despite the lack of a deciphered script, we've managed to piece together some clues about their economic setup through archaeological finds. The remains of warehouses suggest a highly organized system of storage and distribution, hinting at a level of economic sophistication that would make even modern logistics experts nod in appreciation. And while it's tempting to romanticize this system as a perfectly oiled machine, the reality is likely more akin to a bustling market where barter and negotiation were the order of the day. The city's economy wasn't just about trade and crafts, though. It also relied heavily on agriculture, which, thanks to their advanced irrigation systems, was remarkably productive. The Indus Valley was the breadbasket of the region, and controlling its resources was akin to holding the keys to the kingdom. This agrarian prowess fueled Mohenjo-daro's trade networks, allowing it to export surplus goods and import what it couldn't produce. This interconnectedness was both a strength and a vulnerability, as reliance on trade meant that any disruption in the supply chain could have serious repercussions. Essentially, they were living the ancient version of globalization, long before it was cool or even a term. Now, let's debunk a few myths about this enigmatic economic powerhouse. While the romantic notion of a utopic society where everyone lived in harmony is appealing, reality was probably a little less idyllic. Social stratification existed, as evidenced by the distinct separation between the citadel and the lower town. The elite likely controlled the most lucrative aspects of trade and agriculture, while the lower classes did the heavy lifting. It wasn't all kumbayas and group hugs. There were likely hierarchies and power struggles, just like in any society. But here's where it gets fascinating. Mohenjo-daro had no obvious signs of a ruling class or religious elite, such as palaces or grand temples, which has left historians scratching their heads. How did they manage such a complex society without the usual trappings of power? It's like finding out your favorite band's greatest hits album was produced without a single rehearsal. Some speculate that it was a more egalitarian society than its contemporaries, but without a Rosetta Stone-like breakthrough, we're left with more questions than answers. Despite these uncertainties, Mohenjo-daro's impact on trade and commerce was undeniable. Its network extended far beyond its borders, a testament to the ingenuity and ambition of its people. They were the movers and shakers of their time, setting a standard for economic interconnectivity that would take centuries to replicate. As we sift through the ruins of this ancient city, it becomes clear that Mohenjo-daro was more than just an architectural marvel. It was a socio-economic powerhouse that defied the limitations of its time. It's a place where urban planning met economic ambition, and the echoes of its bustling markets can still be heard today. This was a society that understood the value of trade, the power of agriculture, and the importance of connectivity long before globalization became a buzzword. And while the mystery of their undeciphered script continues to tantalize historians, their legacy as one of the ancient world's greatest trading centers remains unchallenged. So, as we leave the bustling bazaars of Mohenjo-daro behind, keep in mind that our journey through this ancient city is far from over. There are still layers to uncover, mysteries to solve, and stories to tell. As we delve deeper, we'll explore the cultural and political dynamics that shaped this incredible civilization. The Indus Valley still has secrets to share, and it invites us to listen closely to the whispers of the past. As we continue to unravel the mysteries of Mohenjo-daro, let's peel back another layer of this ancient city's enigma, its political landscape, or rather, the glaring absence of one. You'd expect a city of this scale and sophistication to feature palatial structures where some ruler with a penchant for opulence would reside. But no, Mohenjo-daro shrugs off such notions like a minimalist who's just been shown a Baroque dining room set. Instead, we find no thrones, no grand palaces, no evidence of a king lounging on a gilded chaise longue issuing decrees while being fanned by servants. It seems the people here were too busy mastering urban planning to bother with crowning a monarch. Now, before we start picturing Mohenjo-daro as some egalitarian utopia where everyone held hands and sang kumbaya, let's get real. The absence of grandiose palaces and temples doesn't automatically translate to a society without hierarchy or control. It suggests a different style of governance, one that might have been more communal or decentralized. Picture a committee meeting instead of a royal court, more spreadsheets and less splendor. The city planners were probably more concerned with laying down sewage systems than laying down the law, which, let's be honest, is probably a better use of resources. But how exactly did this society function without a central figurehead? Well, that's where things get interesting. The lack of a centralized government doesn't mean there was chaos, far from it. The level of organization required to maintain such an advanced urban setup suggests that they had systems in place that worked like a well-oiled machine, or a well-drained city in this case. Perhaps they had councils or assemblies that made decisions collectively, ensuring that no one individual hogged all the power or glory. It's like socialism, but without the manifesto. This absence of a king or pharaoh also hints at a society that might have placed communal welfare above personal aggrandizement. The resources that might have otherwise gone towards building colossal statues or decadent palaces were instead funneled into public works, drainage, housing, and trade infrastructure. Imagine a modern government that spends more on pothole repairs than political campaigns. Revolutionary, right? While it's tempting to romanticize Mohenjo-daro as some proto-democratic paradise, we should tread carefully. Romantic narratives have a way of glossing over the messier aspects of human nature. It's more likely that while there was no single ruler, there were still those who held sway over resources and decisions. Social stratification existed, as evidenced by the citadel and the lower town divide. Power dynamics probably played out in subtler ways, with influence peddled behind closed doors or at the marketplace rather than from a throne. The real kicker here is that despite the absence of a centralized monarchy, Mohenjo-daro was able to maintain order and thrive. This tells us something profound about their societal structures. They might not have needed a singular figurehead because their systems of trade, communal decision-making, and urban planning were robust enough to sustain them. It's a bit like finding out a rock band has been making hits without a lead singer. Economically, this decentralized structure could have had its perks. With no king gobbling up resources to fund his palace or military campaigns, the wealth might have been more evenly distributed, or at least more so than in other ancient empires. This would have allowed for greater investment in trade and infrastructure, fueling Mohenjo-daro's economic engine even further. It's as if they were the ancient equivalent of a cooperative, where everyone had a stake in the prosperity of the city. Of course, the lack of centralized power also meant that Mohenjo-daro was potentially more vulnerable to external threats. Without a standing army or fortified palace to rally behind, the city might have been an easier target for invaders. This might explain why the city, despite its advanced systems, eventually fell into decline. It's a poignant reminder that while decentralized governance can foster innovation and communal welfare, it can also leave a society exposed to the whims of more aggressive neighbors. In many ways, Mohenjo-daro's political landscape, or its absence, challenges our assumptions about what makes a civilization successful. It forces us to reconsider the role of centralized power in maintaining order and prosperity. The city's ability to thrive without a king or a palace is a testament to the ingenuity and adaptability of its people. It's a narrative that speaks to the potential for human societies to organize themselves in ways that prioritize collective well-being over individual power. As we reflect on Mohenjo-daro's unique political setup, it becomes clear that the city was as much a social experiment as it was an architectural marvel. Its legacy invites us to question our own assumptions about governance and power, and to consider the possibility that there are alternative paths to societal success. Mohenjo-daro's story is far from over, and as we delve deeper, we'll continue to uncover the complexities and contradictions that make this ancient city so fascinating. The Indus Valley still holds many secrets, and we're only just beginning to scratch the surface. But let's not get too comfortable with Mohenjo-daro's past successes because, as history loves to remind us, even the most advanced societies can face a rapid decline. So, what happened to our ancient urban maestro? Well, grab your archaeological detective hat because theories abound, and none of them involve aliens, unfortunately. First up, climate change, a modern-day boogeyman that's been haunting civilizations since, well, forever. Around 1900 BCE, the Indus Valley region started experiencing a significant shift in climate. Imagine the Indus River turning into that unreliable friend who shows up late to every party. The river, once robust and dependable, began to change its course, and the monsoons decided to take a more erratic turn. This wasn't just a minor inconvenience, it was the kind of environmental shake-up that could turn a thriving agrarian society into a struggling ghost town. The fertile lands that had been the backbone of Mohenjo-daro's economy were no longer producing the bumper crops they once did. Think of it as an ancient version of the toilet paper shortage, except instead of TP, it was wheat and barley, the staples of survival. But climate wasn't the only suspect in this historical whodunit. Enter the theory of Aryan invasions. Some historians propose that around the same time, Indo-European tribes, known as the Aryans, might have started moving into the Indus Valley region. This theory suggests that they could have been the uninvited guests who brought along their own brand of chaos, disrupting the existing societal order. However, it's important to note that this theory has its critics, primarily because there's scant archaeological evidence to back up the idea of a violent takeover. It's more like the Aryans might have just wandered in, found the place a bit run down, and decided to hang their hats, rather than launching a full-scale assault. And let's not forget the possibility of internal decline. Mohenjo-daro might have simply succumbed to the bane of every great city, bureaucracy, and over-expansion. Imagine a city council meeting where how to fix the drainage system turned into a recurring agenda point that never got resolved. The very systems that once fueled their prosperity trade networks, political structures, urban infrastructure could have become cumbersome and inefficient. When you add a dash of environmental woes and the potential for external threats, it's not hard to see how things could unravel. It's the classic tale of too much of a good thing turning sour like every sequel that should have stopped at the first movie. But here's the real kicker. Despite all these theories, no single explanation perfectly accounts for Mohenjo-daro's decline. It's a cautionary tale wrapped in a mystery, tied with a bow of uncertainty. What we do know is that by 1700 BCE, the city was largely abandoned, its streets and buildings left to the sands of time and the imagination of future archaeologists. Mohenjo-daro became a forgotten relic, only to be rediscovered in the 1920s, sparking a renewed interest in the ancient civilization that had once thrived there. So, what does Mohenjo-daro's story teach us? For one, it's a powerful reminder that even the most advanced societies are vulnerable to the whims of nature and geopolitical shifts. It's a testament to human ingenuity, yes, but also a sobering lesson on the precariousness of civilization. No matter how well you plan, sometimes life throws you a curveball, or in this case, a river that decides it's had enough of your city's nonsense. In many ways, Mohenjo-daro is a mirror reflecting our own contemporary challenges: climate change, resource management, social organization. Sound familiar? The past has a cheeky way of highlighting our modern struggles, showing us that while technology may have evolved, the fundamental problems remain strikingly consistent. And perhaps that's the grand irony. Thousands of years later, we're still wrestling with the same issues, albeit with fancier tools and a bit more existential dread. Now, as we take a step back from the ruins of Mohenjo-daro, let's acknowledge the beauty in its rise and fall. It was a civilization that dared to dream big, to carve out an existence on the frontier of human capability. It reminds us that history is not just a series of events, but a tapestry of human ambition, resilience, and, yes, occasional folly. The city's legacy is not just in its bricks and drainage systems, but in the spirit of innovation and community that it embodied. In the end, Mohenjo-daro's story is a poignant testament to the idea that even the best-laid plans can go awry. But that's what makes history so fascinating and, dare I say, comforting. It's a reminder that the human story is one of constant adaptation, learning, and sometimes letting go. So, as we close the chapter on this ancient metropolis, let's carry forward its lessons and its spirit. And who knows? Maybe the next time you're stuck in traffic, you'll find yourself wondering how those ancient city planners would have dealt with your predicament. Spoiler, it probably involved better drainage. Isabella Bird's life reads like a rebellious adventure novel written against the backdrop of 19th century societal norms, with a plot twist that involves a lot of seasickness. Born in 1831 in Yorkshire, England, Isabella was the daughter of a clergyman, a role that came with more sermons than salary. Despite the usual expectations for women of her time, marry well, stay home, and try not to faint from the corsets, Isabella had other plans. Her early years were marked by a litany of health issues that could fill a Victorian medical textbook: spinal problems, insomnia, and general malaise, a condition that was as vague as it was fashionable among the upper middle class. But here's the kicker. Instead of resigning herself to the life of a Victorian damsel, Isabella decided that travel was the cure for what ailed her. In 1854, at the age of 23, she set sail for America, because why settle for smelling salts when you could have the bracing air of the Atlantic? Her father, possibly seeing the chance for some respite from his daughter's ailments, funded her trip with $100, which was a hefty sum in those days, equivalent to about $12,000 today. This decision might have seemed counterintuitive, like treating a fear of heights with a bungee jump, but it was just the beginning of her lifelong wanderlust. Now, let's talk context. In the Victorian era, the idea of a woman traipsing across continents alone was about as popular as a wet blanket at a summer picnic. Women were expected to embody the virtues of domesticity and modesty, not gallivant on foreign soil. But Isabella didn't just challenge these norms, she obliterated them. Her travels were a middle finger to the societal constraints of her time, a feat so bold it would have made even the most daring of her male contemporaries pause. Her first journey to America was a whirlwind of cultural misadventures and geographic marvels. Upon arriving in Boston, Isabella found herself in a land where the accents were as thick as the clam chowder and the humour as dry as the New England autumn. Her accounts of this trip, later published, are peppered with wry observations and a few choice words about the American penchant for spitting. One might say she was less than impressed by the local habits, noting with a mix of horror and fascination the expectoration that seemed to punctuate every street corner conversation. Isabella's health, remarkably, seemed to improve with every mile she travelled. One could argue it was the exhilarating freedom that the open road offered, or maybe it was just that she finally found an environment where her restlessness was an asset, not a liability. Her letters home brimmed with anecdotes that would make any armchair traveller envious. In one instance, she recounted a buggy ride through the Ohio countryside, where the road was more pothole than path, and her driver seemed to have a death wish. "One does not so much travel as lurch from place to place," she quipped, capturing the essence of 19th century American infrastructure in a sentence. But let's not romanticize too much. Travel in the 1850s was no luxury cruise. It involved grueling journeys overland and sea, with accommodations that were more akin to livestock transport than passenger comfort. Yet Isabella thrived in these conditions, fueled by curiosity and a stubborn resolve that would have seen her climb Everest if it had been an option back then. Her travels in America would set the stage for further adventures across the globe. But what made Isabella truly remarkable was her ability to translate her experiences into vivid narratives that captivated audiences back home. Her writing wasn't just about the destinations, it was a commentary on the human condition, a reflection on the oddities of cultural exchange, and a testament to the resilience of one very determined woman. Isabella Bird didn't just travel, she documented, analysed and critiqued the world around her, all while maintaining a sense of humour that could cut through the fog of any dreary day. She was, in every sense, a pioneer, not just for women, but for anyone who ever dared to step off the beaten path and into the unknown. Her story is a reminder that sometimes the best way to find yourself is to get completely, utterly lost. And in Isabella's case, that meant embracing the chaos of an era and emerging as one of its most fascinating figures. Now, as we hitch our metaphorical wagon to 1873, Isabella Bird is about to take her wanderlust to a whole new level by heading straight to the Rocky Mountains. These weren't the Instagram-ready Rockies of today, where every peak is a potential selfie backdrop. No, these were the OG Rockies, raw, untamed, and as inviting as a porcupine in a petting zoo. The Wild West wasn't just a setting for dime novels, it was a place where life could be as unpredictable as the weather and as harsh as a bad cup of cowboy coffee. Isabella, ever the Victorian rebel, decided that the best way to explore this rugged landscape was on horseback. Not exactly the genteel carriage rides around Hyde Park she might have grown up with, but that was precisely the point. And here's the kicker. She did it wearing men's clothing. This wasn't some early form of cosplay. It was practical. Imagine trying to mount a horse with a skirt that could double as a parachute. Her choice of attire was as much about functionality as it was a silent protest against societal constraints, though it probably raised some eyebrows higher than a saloon's swinging doors. Her adventures in the Rockies brought her face to face with Rocky Mountain Jim Nugent, a character who seemed like he'd been pulled straight out of a Western melodrama. Jim was a one-eyed trapper with the kind of rugged charm that could make a rattlesnake swoon and a penchant for whiskey that would make any bartender reconsider their life choices. Their interactions were a peculiar dance of mutual respect and intellectual sparring. Jim, with his grizzled demeanour and rough edges, was the very embodiment of the frontier spirit, an anti-hero in a world that was more Deadwood than Disneyland. Isabella's descriptions of Jim are laced with her characteristic wit and sharp observation. She referred to him as a man any woman might love, but no sane woman would marry. Talk about a backhanded compliment. Yet her relationship with Jim was not some tragic romantic subplot. It was a testament to her ability to navigate the complex social dynamics of the frontier with a grace that belied her surroundings. They both shared a love for the untamed wilderness and an understanding of its inherent dangers. But let's pause for a reality check. The Wild West, as much as Hollywood loves to romanticize it, was not a land of endless freedom for all. It was a place where lawlessness often reigned supreme, where vigilante justice was more common than a handshake, and where survival depended on a combination of grit and luck. The popular image of cowboys riding into the sunset often glosses over the fact that those sunsets marked the end of brutal, back-breaking days. Isabella's journeys revealed a land of stark contrasts, breathtaking natural beauty juxtaposed against the brutal realities of frontier life. Her writings from this period are a masterclass in myth-busting. She paints a vivid picture of the frontier, not as a simplistic backdrop for heroics, but as a living, breathing entity full of contradictions. For instance, while the West was often hailed as a land of opportunity, it was also one of intense hardship. The gold rushes and land grabs that drew many out west were more likely to leave people broke than rich. Isabella saw firsthand the harsh economic realities of mining towns, where fortunes were as fleeting as the mountain streams. Isabella's journey through the Rockies was peppered with what you might call character-building experiences, the kind that would make a lesser soul turn back. She encountered blizzards that could freeze the ink in her pen, rivers that seemed to have a personal vendetta against her, and wildlife that looked at her like she was the main course. Yet, through it all, her wit remained as sharp as a mountain peak. She wrote of one particularly harrowing horseback ride through a snowstorm with a nonchalance that would make even the most seasoned adventurers raise an eyebrow. The snow was blinding, the path treacherous, and my horse seemed as keen on survival as a lemming, she quipped, her humour a beacon in the blizzard. Economically speaking, Isabella's travels were self-funded, the fact that adds an extra layer of admiration to her story. She wasn't backed by a wealthy patron or a government grant. Instead, she relied on her writing to finance her adventures. Her letters and articles published in British newspapers provided both an income and a platform to share her unique perspective. It's a testament to her resilience and resourcefulness, a Victorian-era hustle that paved the way for modern travel writers. What makes Isabella's journey through the Rocky Mountains so compelling isn't just the physical challenges she faced, but the way she documented them. Her accounts are not just travelogues, they're social commentaries wrapped in adventure narratives. She offered readers back home a glimpse into a world that was as far removed from the drawing rooms of England as one could imagine. Her writings challenged the romanticized notions of the frontier, revealing a place where the human spirit was tested at every turn. In many ways, Isabella Bird was a pioneer of a different sort. She was a bridge between worlds, between the genteel society she came from and the rugged frontier she explored. Her experiences in the Rockies were not just about personal discovery, but about expanding the horizons of those who would never set foot in such untamed territory. She showed that courage wasn't just about facing external challenges, but also about challenging one's own preconceptions. As we leave Isabella amidst the towering peaks and endless horizons of the Rockies, it's clear that her journey was far from over. Her time in the Wild West was just one chapter in a life filled with adventure and discovery. And while we might be tempted to picture her as a lone rider against a crimson sky, it's her words, rich with insight and humour, that continue to ride on, offering us a window into a world that was as wild as it was wondrous. So, stay tuned, because Isabella's story doesn't end here. It's just getting started. As Isabella Bird left the rugged romance of the Rockies behind, her sights were set on a new horizon, one that lay across the vast expanse of the Pacific. In 1878, she embarked on yet another intrepid adventure, this time to the culturally rich lands of Japan and Korea. And let's be clear, this wasn't your average Victorian holiday. Forget about afternoon tea and leisurely strolls through manicured gardens. Isabella was diving headfirst into lands where tradition and modernity were locked in a dance as intricate as a kabuki performance. Japan in the late 19th century was a nation in the throes of transformation. After centuries of self-imposed isolation under the Tokugawa shogunate, The country was opening its doors wider than a sumo wrestler's waistband, thanks to the Meiji Restoration of 1868. This period marked Japan's rapid industrialization and modernization, as it raced to catch up with Western powers faster than you can say sushi. Enter Isabella Bird with her trusty pen and insatiable curiosity, ready to document this seismic shift with all the wit and observation she could muster. Isabella arrived in Japan armed with more than just her luggage. She carried a keen eye for detail and a willingness to venture into the less travelled corners of the country. While most Western visitors were content to stick to the bustling streets of Tokyo, or Edo as it was known until 1868, Isabella ventured into the rural heartlands, where the echoes of old Japan still resonated in every rice paddy and temple bell. Her travels took her through landscapes that seemed to defy time itself, where the serene beauty of Mount Fuji loomed majestically over traditional tea houses and cherry blossoms. But make no mistake, Isabella's journey wasn't all Zen gardens and poetic reflections. She encountered the gritty realities of a country in flux, where ancient customs met the relentless march of progress. In her writings, she noted the stark contrasts between the burgeoning urban centres and the rural villages, where the impact of industrialization was as subtle as a samurai's sword. Isabella's observations about Japanese society were as sharp as ever. She marvelled at the discipline and politeness of the Japanese people, traits that seemed as intrinsic to them as sushi to rice. But she wasn't blind to the darker undercurrents. She noted with a certain British forthrightness the social stratification and the struggles of the lower classes. The Meiji era, after all, wasn't just about shiny railways and Western fashions. It was a time of upheaval, where the old ways were being dismantled faster than a kabuki actor's costume change. Our intrepid traveller's next stop was Korea, a land that at the time was known as the Hermit Kingdom due to its isolationist policies. Korea in the 19th century was a place of stark beauty and formidable challenges, where the winds of change were starting to gust through the mountains and palaces. Isabella arrived in 1894, a time when Korea was caught between the ambitions of its powerful neighbours, China and Japan, and the encroaching influence of Western powers. It was a cultural cauldron simmering with potential and danger. In Korea, Isabella's penchant for venturing off the beaten path took her through landscapes that seemed untouched by time. She journeyed through the countryside, where the rhythms of life were dictated by the seasons and the harvest. Her descriptions of the Korean people are filled with affection and admiration, noting their resilience in the face of political turmoil and economic hardship. She observed the intricate social structures and rituals, from the Confucian traditions that permeated daily life to the vibrant markets where everything from silk to spices was bartered with gusto. Isabella's time in Korea also exposed her to the looming shadow of colonialism. The peninsula was becoming a geopolitical chessboard, with foreign powers eyeing its strategic position like a cat eyes a canary. Japan's annexation of Korea in 1910 was still a few years away, but the signs were there for those who knew where to look. Isabella, never one to shy away from the truth, noted the growing Japanese influence and the tensions it stirred among the Korean people. Her writings serve as a testament to the complexities of colonial interactions, where the promise of progress often came with a hefty price tag. But let's not forget the humour in Isabella's observations. Her accounts of cultural differences are peppered with a wit that could slice through the stiffest of Victorian collars. Her description of a Korean meal, a sumptuous spread of dishes where the more adventurous palate could find flavours as unexpected as a plot twist in a Dickens novel. Her ability to find humour in the unfamiliar is part of what makes her writing so enduring. Take, for instance, offering a lens through which we can glimpse the humanity and cultural exchange. Economically speaking, Isabella's travels in Asia were a reflection of the broader global shifts of the time. The opening of trade routes and the introduction of Western technologies were reshaping economies at a pace that would make a modern-day start-up blush. Japan's rapid industrialization was an economic marvel, with factories sprouting up like mushrooms after a monsoon, while Korea's economy remained largely agrarian, caught in the crossfire of competing influences. Isabella didn't just document these changes, she provided a commentary on their implications. Her writings offer insights into the economic realities faced by the people she encountered, from the merchants navigating the shifting tides of trade to the farmers whose lives were tethered to the land. She understood that behind every economic statistic were real people with hopes and dreams as vivid as a Kyoto sunrise. As Isabella Bird traversed the landscapes of Japan and Korea, she left behind more than footprints. She left a legacy of understanding and empathy. Her travels serve as a reminder that the world is a tapestry of diverse cultures, each with its own stories to tell. Her ability to bridge these worlds with her words is what continues to captivate readers today, offering a window into a time of transformation and discovery. So, as we close this chapter on Isabella's Asian adventures, it's clear that her journey was far from ordinary. It was a voyage of exploration, not just of distant lands, but of the human spirit. And while her travels in Asia were just one part of her remarkable life, they remain a testament to her enduring curiosity and courage. Isabella Bird didn't just cross continents, she crossed cultural divides, armed with nothing more than a pen, a sense of humor, and a relentless desire to understand the world around her. Stay tuned, because this story is only getting richer, like a fine steak aged to perfection. With her Asian escapades behind her, Isabella Bird was far from ready to hang up her travelling boots. Her next stop, the Middle East and India regions, wrapped in layers of mystique and colonial complexity denser than a Victorian novel. And Isabella, ever the intrepid traveller, was ready to peel back the layers with her usual blend of curiosity and candid critique. The Middle East in the late 19th century was a tapestry woven with threads of ancient empires, burgeoning nationalism, and colonial jockeying. Isabella arrived at a time when the Ottoman Empire was often referred to as the sick man of Europe, a nickname as flattering as a soggy crumpet. The empire was in decline, losing its grip on territories, while European powers circled like vultures with diplomatic niceties masking economic ambitions. Isabella's journey took her through the Levant, that stretch of land along the eastern Mediterranean that includes modern-day Syria, Lebanon, Israel, and Jordan. Her observations of the region were as vivid as a sunrise over the desert dunes. She described bustling bazaars where the air was thick with the scent of spices and the sound of bargaining that was more competitive than a cricket match. Here, the economic realities were as stark as the desert landscape, where wealth rubbed shoulders with poverty in a dance as ancient as the pyramids. But Isabella wasn't just there to sightsee. Her writing reveals a sharp eye for the political undercurrents. She noted the tensions simmering beneath the surface as local rulers navigated the treacherous waters of colonial influence. The British, French, and others were busy carving out spheres of influence, often under the guise of bringing civilization, a term that was as fixable as a politician's promise. In India, Isabella's journey took on a different hue. Arriving in the late 1880s, she stepped into a land that was the jewel in the British colonial crown, yet simultaneously a pressure cooker of discontent. The British Raj had a knack for romanticizing their rule, painting it as a benevolent force bringing progress and railways. Isabella, with her pen as sharp as ever, was not one to be taken in by such propaganda. Her travels through India brought her into contact with both the splendour and squalor of colonial rule. She visited the princely states, where Maharajas lived in opulence that would make a European royal look like a pauper. Yet, she also witnessed the grinding poverty of the rural countryside, where farmers toiled under oppressive taxes and famines loomed like dark clouds. Isabella's interactions with local rulers were as fascinating as they were revealing. She wrote of the Nizam of Hyderabad, whose palace was a showcase of wealth. Think diamonds the size of quail eggs and elephants decked out like mobile jewelry stores. Yet she also noted the political tightrope these rulers walked, balancing homage to the British overlords with their own traditions and authority. Her commentary on British officials was as sardonic as it was insightful. She described the colonial administrators with a mix of admiration for their organizational skills and disdain for their paternalistic attitudes. In one particularly biting observation, she noted that some British officials seemed to regard India as a personal playground, where they could indulge in a level of luxury that would be frowned upon back home. It was a system that often valued appearances over substance, where the pomp of the Raj was a thin veneer over systemic inequalities. Economically, the British presence in India was a double-edged sword. On one hand, the introduction of railways, telegraphs, and modern infrastructure was transforming the landscape. On the other, the economic policies were designed to serve British interests, often at the expense of local industries. The cotton mills in Lancashire thrived while Indian weavers found themselves out of work, a fact that Isabella noted with characteristic bluntness. Isabella's writings provide a stark contrast to the romanticized image of the British Raj. She didn't shy away from highlighting the exploitation and the economic realities faced by the average Indian. Her accounts serve as a reminder that behind the grand architecture and colonial pageantry were people whose lives were dictated by forces beyond their control. Yet, Isabella's journey was not just about critiquing colonial policies. It was also a testament to the enduring human spirit. She was captivated by the rich tapestry of Indian culture, from the vibrant festivals that lit up the night sky like fireworks to the spiritual traditions that offered solace in a world of change. Her travels through the Middle East and India were more than just a series of destinations. They were a journey through the complexities of colonialism and its impact on societies. Isabella Bird didn't just document what she saw, she analysed it, questioned it, and presented it with a clarity that was as refreshing as a monsoon after a long dry season. In her later writings, Isabella reflected on the broader implications of her travels, noting that the world was becoming increasingly interconnected, for better or worse. Her insights into the economic and political realities of the Middle East and India offer a window into the forces that were shaping the modern world. As we leave Isabella amidst the rich landscapes and cultural tapestries of the Middle East and India, it's clear that her journey was far from over. Her adventures were not just about exploring distant lands, but about uncovering the truths that lay beneath the surface. Isabella Bird's story is a testament to the power of curiosity and the importance of questioning the status quo. Stay tuned, because her next chapter promises to be just as enlightening. Isabella Bird's story doesn't just end with her physical journeys. It evolves into a legacy that transcends time and space. Fast forward to the late 19th century, and we see Isabella settling into her later years, not in a rocking chair recounting tales to grandchildren, but as a member of the Royal Geographical Society. Yes, you heard that right. In 1892, she became the Society's first female member, a title that would be groundbreaking if it weren't so overdue. This was the Victorian equivalent of shattering the glass ceiling with a sledgehammer, all while wearing a corset. Now, Isabella wasn't just sipping tea while basking in accolades. Her later years were peppered with lectures and writings that continued to challenge societal norms. She didn't just open doors for herself, she flung them wide for future generations of women travellers. Her influence on travel writing is akin to setting the compass for a new direction. Her narratives were not just about the exotic locales, but the raw, unvarnished truth of the human condition she encountered. Her books, like A Lady's Life in the Rocky Mountains and The Yangtze Valley and Beyond, were bestsellers, devoured by an audience hungry for adventure and authenticity. And while it's tempting to picture her as a lone wolf, blazing trails where no woman had gone before, the reality is that she was part of a broader movement. The late 1800s were a time when women were beginning to assert themselves in public life, and Isabella's exploits were both a reflection and a catalyst of this change. She didn't just inspire women to travel, she encouraged them to think, to write, and to speak out. In a world where women's roles were as tightly laced as their corsets, she was a breath of fresh air, unapologetic and unrestrained. But let's not get carried away on a wave of romanticism. It's easy to paint Isabella as a flawless heroine, a lone crusader for gender equality. The truth, however, is that she was a product of her time, with all the biases and blind spots that come with it. Her observations, while insightful, were often coloured by the colonial attitudes of the era. She was, after all, a Victorian woman travelling through a world shaped by imperial ambitions. Yet, it's precisely this complexity that makes her legacy so intriguing. She wasn't just a champion for women's rights. She was a mirror reflecting the contradictions of her time. Isabella's influence on modern travel culture is like the ripples from a stone dropped into a pond. Her emphasis on personal experience and honest recounting set the stage for the travel writers and bloggers of today who strive for authenticity in a world that often values filters over facts. Moreover, her life is a reminder that travel is not just about collecting passport stamps, but about expanding one's horizons, both literally and figuratively. In her footsteps, we see the rise of a new generation of explorers who value depth over distance, experience over escapism. So, what do we make of the myths surrounding Isabella Bird? Was she a fearless adventurer, or a Victorian tourist with a penchant for the picturesque? The answer, like most things in history, is not black and white. Her life was a tapestry of courage and contradiction, woven with threads of ambition and introspection. She was as much a part of the 19th century zeitgeist as she was a disruptor of it. Her story is a testament to the power of the individual to transcend societal constraints, but it's also a reminder of the limitations imposed by the very society she sought to change. As we wrap up this whirlwind tour of Isabella Bird's life, it's clear that her legacy is as multifaceted as the landscapes she traversed. She was a pioneer, not just in the geographical sense, but in the realm of ideas. Her writings continue to inspire those who dare to step off the beaten path, who seek not just to see the world but to understand it. And while she may have passed into history, her spirit of adventure lives on in every traveller who straps on a backpack and sets out to explore the unknown. Isabella Bird didn't just travel the world, she redefined it. Her life was a testament to the belief that the world is vast, and it's up to us to make it our own. Whether she was navigating the Rockies or the complexities of colonial India, she did so with a vigour that defied convention and an insight that transcended her era. So here's to Isabella, an explorer at heart, a writer by trade, and a legend by necessity. Her journey, like all great stories, reminds us that the best tales are not just about where we've been, but where we're courageous enough to go next. And if her life teaches us anything, it's that the world is an open book, just waiting for someone brave enough to turn the page.